Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. It's Baby Hulk Rage back with another read along with me. So we are on chapter 27 in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire still. Let's see. Actually, let's see how many chapters we have left in this book. I just want to see. Because I think we're getting pretty close to the end here. We have 11 chapters left, and we're on 27. So we'll read about 3 to 4 today, depending on how long the chapters are. So let's get to getting. If I can find where we're at. Here we go. Chapter 27, Padfoot Returns. One of the best things about the aftermath of the second task was that everybody was very keen to hear details of what had happened down in the lake, which meant that Ron was getting to share Harry's limelight for once. Harry noticed that Ron's version of events changed subtly with every retelling. At first, he gave what seemed to be the truth. It tallied with Hermione's story. Anyway, Dumbledore had put all the hostages into a bewitched sleep in Professor McGonagall's office, first assuring them that they would be quite safe and would awake when they were back above the water. 1 week later, however, Ron was telling a thrilling tale of kidnapping in which he struggled single-handedly against 50 heavily armed merpeople who had to beat him into submission before tying him up. "But I had my wand hidden up my sleeve," he reassured Padma Patel, who seemed to be a lot keener on Ron now that he was getting so much attention and was making a point of talking to him every time they passed in the corridors. "I could have taken those idiots any time I wanted." "What were you going to do, snore at them?" said Hermione waspishly. People had been teasing her so much about being the thing that Victor Crumb would most miss that she was in a rather tetchy mood. Ron's ears went red, and thereafter he reverted to the bewitched sleep version of events. As they entered March, the weather became drier, but cruel winds skinned their hands and faces every time they went out into the grounds. There were delays in the post because the owls kept being blown off course. The brown owl that Harry had sent to Sirius with the dates of the Hogsmeade weekend turned up at breakfast on Friday morning with half its feathers sticking up the wrong way. Harry had no sooner torn off Sirius's reply than it took flight, clearly afraid it was going to be sent outside again. Sirius's letter was almost as short as the previous one. "Be at Stile at end of road out of Hogsmeade, past Dervish and Bangs, at 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. Bring as much food as you can." "He hasn't come back to Hogsmeade," said Ron incredulously. "It looks like it, doesn't it?" said Hermione. "I can't believe him," said Harry tensely. "If he's caught. Made it so far, though, hasn't he?" said Ron. "And it's not like the place is swarming with Dementors anymore." Harry folded up the letter, thinking, if he was honest with himself, he really wanted to see Sirius again. He therefore approached the final lesson of the afternoon, double potions, feeling considerably more cheerful than he usually did when descending the steps to the dungeons. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle were standing in a huddle outside the classroom door with Pansy Parkinson's gang of Slytherin girls. All of them were looking at something Harry couldn't see and snickering heartily. Pansy's pug-like face peered excitedly around Goyle's broad back as Harry, Ron, and Hermione approached. There they are, she giggled, and the knot of Slytherins broke apart. Harry saw that Pansy had a magazine in her hands, Witch Weekly. The moving picture on the front showed a curly-haired witch who was smiling toothily and pointing at a large sponge cake with her wand. "You might find something to interest you in there, Granger," Pansy said loudly, and she threw the magazine at Hermione, who caught it, looking startled. At that moment, the dungeon door opened and Snape beckoned them all inside. Hermione, Harry, and Ron headed for a table at the back of the dungeon as well. Once Snape had turned his back to them to write up the ingredients of today's potions on the blackboard, Hermione hastily rifled through the magazine under the desk. At last, in the center pages, Hermione found what they were looking at. Harry and Ron leaned in closer. A color photograph of Harry headed a short piece entitled "Harry Potter's Secret Heartache." "A boy like no other, perhaps, yet a boy suffering all the usual pangs of adolescence," writes Rita Skeeter. "Deprived of love since the tragic demise of his parents, 14-year-old Harry Potter thought he found solace in his steady girlfriend at Hogwarts, Muggle-born Hermione Granger. Little did he know that he would shortly be suffering yet another emotional blow in a life already littered with personal loss. Miss Granger, a plain but ambitious girl, seems to have a taste for famous wizards that Harry alone cannot satisfy. Since the arrival at Hogwarts of Victor Crumb, Bulgarian seeker and hero of the last World Quidditch Cup, Miss Granger has been toying with both boys' affections. Crumb, who is openly smitten with the devious Miss Granger, has already invited her to visit him in Bulgaria over the summer holidays and insists that he has never felt this way about any other girl. However, it might not be Miss Granger's doubtful natural charms that have captured those unfortunate boys' interest. She's really ugly, says Pansy Parkinson, a pretty and vivacious fourth-year student, but she'd be well up to making a love potion. She's quite brainy. I think that's how she's doing it. Love potions are, of course, banned at Hogwarts, and no doubt Albus Dumbledore will want to investigate these claims. In the meantime, Harry Potter's well-wishers must hope that, next time he bestows his heart on a worthier candidate. I told you, Ron hissed at Hermione as she stared down at the article. I told you not to annoy Rita Skeeter. She made you out to be some sort of Scarlet Woman. Hermione stopped looking astonished and snorted with laughter. Scarlet Woman, she repeated, shaking with suppressed giggles as she looked around at Ron. It's what my mum calls them. Ron muttered, his ears going red. If that's the best Rita can do, she's losing her touch, said Hermione, still giggling as she threw Witch weakly onto the empty chair beside her. What a pile of old rubbish. She looked over at the Slytherins who were all watching her and Harry closely across the room to see if they had been upset by the article. Hermione gave them a sarcastic smile and a wave, and she, Harry, and Ron started unpacking the ingredients they would need for their wit-sharpening potion. There's something funny, though, said Hermione 10 minutes later, holding her pestle suspended over a bowl of scarab beetles. How could Rita Skeeter have known? Known what? Said Ron quickly. You haven't been mixing up love potions, have you? Don't be stupid, Hermione snapped, starting to pound up her beetles again. No, it's just, how did she know Victor asked me to visit him over the summer? Hermione blushed scarlet as she said this and determinedly avoided Ron's eyes. What? Said Ron, dropping his pestle with a loud clank. He asked me right after he'd pulled me out of the lake, Hermione muttered. After he'd got rid of his shark's head, Madame Pomfrey gave us both blankets, and then he sort of pulled me away from the judges so they wouldn't hear, and he said if I wasn't doing anything over the summer, would I like to? And what did you say? Said Ron, who had picked up his pestle and was grinding it on the desk, a good 6 inches from his bowl because he was looking at Hermione. And he did say he'd never felt the same way about anyone else, Hermione went on, going so red now that Harry could almost feel the heat coming from her. But how could Rita Skeeter have heard him? She wasn't there. Or was she? Maybe she has got an invisibility cloak. Maybe she sneaked onto the grounds to watch the second task. And what did you say? Ron repeated, pounding his pestle down so hard that it dented the desk. Well, I was too busy seeing whether you and Harry were okay, too. Fascinating, though your social life undoubtedly is, Miss Granger, said an icy voice right behind them, and all three of them jumped. I must ask you not to discuss it in my class. 10 points from Gryffindor. Snape had glided over to their desk while they were talking. The whole class was now looking around at them. Malfoy took the opportunity to flash Potter stinks across the dungeon at Harry. Ah, reading magazines under the table as well, Snape added, snatching up the copy of Witch Weekly. A further 10 points from Gryffindor. Oh, but of course, Snape's black eyes glittered as they fell on Rita Skeeter's article. Potter has to keep up with his press cuttings. The dungeon rang with the Slytherins' laughter, and an unpleasant smile curled Snape's thin mouth. To Harry's fury, he began to read the article aloud. Harry Potter's secret heartache. Dear, dear Potter, what's ailing you now? A boy like no other, perhaps. Harry could feel his face burning. Snape was pausing at the end of every sentence to allow the Slytherins a hearty laugh. The article sounded 10 times worse when read by Snape. Even Hermione was blushing scarlet now. Harry Potter's well-wishers must hope that, next time, he bestows his heart upon a worthier candidate. How very touching, sneered Snape, rolling up the magazine to continued glares of laughter from the Slytherins. Well, I think I had better separate the three of you so you can keep your minds on your potions rather than on your tangled love lives. Weasley, you stay here. Miss Granger over there, beside Miss Parkinson. Potter, that table in front of my desk. Move, now. Furious, Harry threw his ingredients and his bag into his cauldron and dragged it up to the front of the dungeon to the empty table. Snape followed, sat down at his desk, and watched Harry unload his cauldron. Determined not to look at Snape, Harry resumed the mashing of his scarab beetles, imagining each one to have Snape's face. All this press attention seems to have inflated your already over-large head, Potter, said Snape quietly, once the rest of the class had settled down again. Harry didn't answer. He knew Snape was trying to provoke him. He had done this before. No doubt he was hoping for an excuse to take a round of 50 points from Gryffindor before the end of the class. You might be laboring under the delusion that the entire wizarding world is impressed with you, Snape went on so quietly that no one else could hear him. Harry continued to pound his scarab beetles, even though he had already reduced them to a very fine powder. But I don't care how many times your picture appears in the papers. To me, Potter, you are nothing but a nasty little boy who considers rules to be beneath him. Harry tipped the powdered beetles into his cauldron and started cutting up his ginger roots. His hands were shaking slightly out of anger, but he kept his eyes down, as though he couldn't hear what Snape was saying to him. So I give you fair warning, Potter, Snape continued in a softer and more dangerous voice. Pint-sized celebrity or not, if I catch you breaking into my office one more time, I haven't been anywhere near your office, said Harry angrily, forgetting his feigned deafness. Don't lie to me, Snape hissed, his fathomless black eyes boring into Harry's. Boomslang skin, gillyweed, both come from my private stores, and I know who stole them. Harry stared back at Snape, determined not to blink or to look guilty. In truth, he hadn't stolen either of these things from Snape. Hermione had taken the boomslang skin back in their second year. They had needed it for the Polyjuice Potion, and while Snape had suspected Harry at the time, he had never been able to prove it. Dobby, of course, had stolen the gillyweed. I don't know what you're talking about, Harry lied coldly. You were out of bed on the night my office was broken into, Snape hissed. I know it, Potter. Now, Mad-Eye Moody might have joined your fan club, but I will not tolerate your behavior. One more nighttime stroll into my office, Potter, and you will pay. Right, said Harry coolly, turning back to his ginger roots. I'll bear that in mind if I ever get the urge to go in there. Snape's eyes flashed. He plunged a hand into the inside of his black robes. For one wild moment, Harry thought Snape was about to pull out his wand and curse him. Then he saw that Snape had drawn out a small crystal bottle of a completely clear potion. Harry stared at it. Do you know what this is, Potter? Snape said, his eyes glittering dangerously again. No, said Harry, with complete honesty this time. It is Burita Serum, a truth potion so powerful that 3 drops would have you spilling your innermost secrets for this entire class to hear, said Snape viciously. Now, the use of this potion is controlled by very strict ministry guidelines, but unless you watch your step, you might just find that my hand slips. Slips. He shook the crystal bottle slightly, right over your evening pumpkin juice. And then, Potter, then we'll find out whether you've been in my office or not. Harry said nothing. He turned back to his ginger roots once more, picked up his knife, and started slicing them again. He didn't like the sound of that truth potion at all, nor would he put it past Snape to slip him some. He repressed a shudder at the thought of what might come spilling out of his mouth if Snape did it, quite apart from landing a whole lot of people in trouble. Hermione and Dobby for a start. There were all the other things he was concealing, like the fact that he was in contact with Sirius, and his insides squirmed at the thought. How he felt about Cho. He tipped his ginger roots into the cauldron too, and wondered whether he ought to take a leaf out of Moody's book and start drinking only from a private hip flask. There was a knock on the dungeon door. Enter, said Snape in his usual voice. The class looked around as the door opened. Professor Karkaroff came in. Everyone watched him as he walked up toward Snape's desk. He was twisting his finger around his goatee and looking agitated. We need to talk, said Karkaroff abruptly when he had reached Snape. He seemed so determined that nobody should hear what he was saying that he was barely opening his lips. It was as though he were a rather poor ventriloquist. Harry kept his eyes on his ginger roots, listening hard. I'll talk to you after my lesson, Karkaroff, Snape muttered, but Karkaroff interrupted him. I want to talk now, while you can't slip off, Severus. You've been avoiding me. After the lesson, Snape snapped, under the pretext of holding up a measuring cup to see if he'd poured out enough armadillo bile. Harry sneaked a sidelong glance at the pair of them. Karkaroff looked extremely worried, and Snape looked angry. Karkaroff hovered behind Snape's desk for the rest of the double period. He seemed intent on preventing Snape from slipping away at the end of class, keen to hear what Karkaroff wanted to say. Harry deliberately knocked over his bottle of armadillo bile with 2 minutes to go to the bell, which gave him an excuse to duck down behind his cauldron and mop up while the rest of the class moved noisily toward the door. What's so urgent? He heard Snape hiss at Karkaroff. This, said Karkaroff, and Harry, peering around the edge of his cauldron, saw Karkaroff pull up the left-hand sleeve of his robe and show Snape something on his inner forearm. Well, said Karkaroff, still making every effort not to move his lips, do you see? It's never been this clear. Never, since... Put it away, snarled Snape, his black eyes sweeping the classroom. But you must have noticed, Karkaroff began in an agitated voice. We can talk later, Karkaroff, spat Snape. Potter, what are you doing? Clearing up my armadillo bottle, Professor, said Harry innocently, straightening up and showing Snape the sodden rag he was holding. Karkaroff turned on his heel and strode out of the dungeon. He looked both worried and angry. Not wanting to remain alone with an exceptionally angry Snape, Harry threw his books and ingredients back into his bag and left at top speed to tell Ron and Hermione what he had just witnessed. They left the castle at noon the next day to find a weak silver sun shining down upon the grounds. The weather was milder than it had been all year, and by the time they arrived in Hogsmeade, all 3 of them had taken off their cloaks and thrown them over their shoulders. The food Sirius had told them to bring was in Harry's bag. They had sneaked a dozen chicken legs, a loaf of bread, and a flask of pumpkin juice from the lunch table. They went into Galdrig's Wizardwear to buy a present for Dobby, where they had fun selecting the most lurid socks they could find, including a pair patterned with flashing gold and silver stars, and another that screamed loudly when they became too smelly. Then at 1:30 they made their way up the high street, past Dervish and Banks, and out toward the edge of the village. Harry had never been in this direction before. The winding lane was leading them out into the wild countryside around Hogsmeade. The cottages were fewer here, and their gardens larger. They were walking toward the foot of the mountain in whose shadow Hogsmeade lay. Then they turned a corner and saw a stile at the end of the lane. Waiting for them, its front paws on the topmost bar, was a very large, shaggy black dog, which was carrying some newspapers in its mouth and looking very familiar. "Hello, Sirius," said Harry when they had reached him. The black dog sniffed Harry's bag eagerly, wagged its tail once, then turned and began to trot away from them across a scrubby patch of ground that rose to meet the rocky foot of the mountain. Harry, Ron, and Hermione climbed over the stile and followed. Sirius led them to the very foot of the mountain, where the ground was covered with boulders and rocks. It was easy for him with his 4 paws, but Harry, Ron, and Hermione were soon out of breath. They followed Sirius higher up onto the mountain itself. For nearly half an hour they climbed a steep, winding, and stony path, following Sirius's wagging tail, sweating in the sun, the shoulder straps of Harry's bag cutting into his shoulders. Then at last Sirius slipped out of sight, and when they reached the place where he had vanished, they saw a narrow fissure in the rock. They squeezed into it and found themselves in a cool, dimly lit cave. Tethered at the end of it, one end of his rope around a large rock, was Buckbeak the Hippogriff, half gray horse, half giant eagle. Buckbeak's fierce orange eyes flashed at the sight of them. All 3 of them bowed low to him, and after regarding them imperiously for a moment, Buckbeak bent his scaly front knees and allowed Hermione to rush forward and stroke his feathery neck. Harry, however, was looking at the black dog, which had just turned into his godfather. Sirius was wearing ragged gray robes, the same ones he had been wearing when he had left Azkaban. His black hair was longer than it had been when he had appeared in the fire, and it was untidy and matted once more. He looked very thin. "Chicken," he said hoarsely after removing the old Daily Prophets from his mouth and throwing them down onto the cave floor. Harry pulled open his bag and handed over the bundle of chicken legs and bread. "Thanks," said Sirius, opening it, grabbing a drumstick, sitting down on the cave floor and tearing off a large chunk with his teeth. "I've been living off rats, mostly. Can't steal too much food from Hogsmeade. I'd draw attention to myself." He grinned up at Harry, but Harry returned the grin only reluctantly. "What are you doing here, Sirius?" he said. "Fulfilling my duty as godfather," said Sirius, gnawing on the chicken bone in a very dog-like way. "Don't worry about it. I'm pretending to be a lovable stray." He was still grinning, but seeing the anxiety in Harry's face, said more seriously, "I want to be on the spot. Your last letter, well, let's just say things are getting fishier. I've been stealing the paper every time someone throws one out, and by the looks of things, I'm not the only one who's getting worried." He nodded at the yellowing Daily Prophets on the cave floor, and Ron picked them up and unfolded them. Harry, however, continued to stare at Sirius. "What if they catch you? What if you're seen? You 3 and Dumbledore are the only ones around here who know I'm an animagus," said Sirius, shrugging and continuing to devour the chicken leg. Ron nudged Harry and passed him the Daily Prophets. There were 2. The first bore the headline, "Mystery Illness of Bartimaeus Crouch." The second, "Ministry Witch Still Missing. Minister of Magic Now Personally Involved." Harry scanned the story about Crouch. Phrases jumped out at him. "Hasn't been seen in public since November. House appears deserted. St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries declined comment. Minister refuses to confirm rumors of critical illness." "They're making it sound like he's dying," said Harry slowly, "but he can't be that ill if he managed to get up here." "My brother's Crouch's personal assistant," Ron informed Sirius. "He says Crouch is suffering from overwork. Mind you, he did look ill last time I saw him up close," said Harry slowly, still reading the story. "The night my name came out of the goblet." "Getting his comeuppance for sacking Winky, isn't he?" said Hermione, an edge to her voice. She was stroking Buckbeak, who was crunching up Sirius's chicken bones. "I bet he wishes he hadn't done it now. Bet he feels the difference now she's not there to look after him." "Hermione's obsessed with house elves," Ron muttered to Sirius, casting Hermione a dark look. Sirius, however, looked interested. "Crouch sacked his house elf?" "Yeah, at the Quidditch World Cup," said Harry, and he launched into the story of the Dark Mark's appearance, and Winky being found with Harry's wand clutched in her hand, and Mr. Crouch's fury. When Harry had finished, Sirius was on his feet again and had started pacing up and down the cave. "Let me get this straight," he said after a while, brandishing a fresh chicken leg. "You first saw the elf in the top box. She was saving Crouch a seat, right?" "Right," said Harry, Ron, and Hermione together. "But Crouch didn't turn up for the match." "No," said Harry. "I think he said he'd been too busy." Sirius paced all around the cave in silence. Then he said, "Harry, did you check your pockets for your wand after you'd left the top box?" Harry thought hard. "No," he said finally. "I didn't need to use it before we got in the forest, and then I put my hand in my pocket, and all that was in there were my omnoculars." He stared at Sirius. Are you saying whoever conjured the mark stole my wand in the top box? It's possible, said Sirius. Winky didn't steal that wand, Hermione insisted. The elf wasn't the only one in that box, said Sirius, his brow furrowed as he continued to pace. Who else was sitting behind you? Loads of people, said Harry. Some Bulgarian ministers, Cornelius Fudge, the Malfoys. The Malfoys, said Ron suddenly, so loudly that his voice echoed all around the cave, and Buckbeak tossed his head nervously. I bet it was Lucius Malfoy. Anyone else? Said Sirius. No one, said Harry. Yes, there was. There was little Bagman, Hermione reminded him. Oh, yeah. I don't know anything about Bagman, except that he used to be beater for the Wimborne Wasps, said Sirius, still pacing. What's he like? He's okay, said Harry. He keeps offering to help me with the Triwizard Tournament. Does he now? Said Sirius, frowning more deeply. I wonder why he'd do that. Says he's taken a liking to me, said Harry. Said Sirius, looking thoughtful. We saw him in the forest just before the Dark Mark appeared, Hermione told Sirius. Remember? She said to Harry and Ron. Yeah, but he didn't stay in the forest, did he? Said Ron. The moment we told him about the riot, he went off to the campsite. How do you know? Hermione shot back. How do you know where he disapparated to? Come off it, said Ron incredulously. Are you saying you reckon Leto Bagman conjured the Dark Mark? It's more likely he did it than Winky, said Hermione stubbornly. Told you, said Ron, looking meaningfully at Sirius. Told you she's obsessed with House, but Sirius held up a hand to silence Ron. When the Dark Mark had been conjured and the elf had been discovered holding Harry's wand, what did Crouch do? Went to look in the bushes, said Harry, but there wasn't anyone else there. Of course, Sirius muttered, pacing up and down. Of course, he'd want to pin it on anyone but his own elf. And then he sacked her. Yes, said Hermione in a heated voice. He sacked her just because she hadn't stayed in her tent and let herself get trampled. Hermione, will you give it a rest with the elf? Said Ron. Sirius shook his head and said, She's got the measure of Crouch better than you have, Ron. If you want to know what a man's like, take a good look at how he treats his inferiors, not his equals. He ran a hand over his unshaven face, evidently thinking hard. All these absences of Barty Crouch's. He goes to the trouble of making sure his house elf saves him a seat at the Quidditch World Cup, but doesn't bother to turn up and watch. He works very hard to reinstate the Triwizard Tournament and then stops coming to that, too. It's not like Crouch. If he's ever taken a day off work because of illness before this, I'll eat Buckbeak. Do you know Crouch, then? Said Harry. Sirius's face darkened. He suddenly looked as menacing as he had the night when Harry first met him, the night when Harry still believed Sirius to be a murderer. Oh, I know Crouch all right, he said quietly. He was the one who gave the order for me to be sent to Azkaban, without a trial. What? Said Ron and Hermione together. You're kidding, said Harry. No, I'm not, said Sirius, taking another great bite of chicken. Crouch used to be head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, didn't you know? Harry, Ron, and Hermione shook their heads. He was tipped for the next Minister of Magic, said Sirius. He's a great wizard, Barty Crouch, powerfully magical, and power-hungry. Oh, never a Voldemort supporter, he said, reading the look on Harry's face. No, Barty Crouch was always very outspoken against the dark side, but then a lot of people who were against the dark side, well, you wouldn't understand. You're too young. That's what my dad said at the World Cup, said Ron with a trace of irritation in his voice. Try us. Why don't you? A grin flashed across Sirius's thin face. All right, I'll try you. He walked once up the cave, back again, and then said, Imagine that Voldemort's powerful now. You don't know who his supporters are. You don't know who's working for him and who isn't. You know he can control people so that they do terrible things without being able to stop themselves. You're scared for yourself and your family and your friends. Every week news comes of more deaths, more disappearances, more torturing. The Ministry of Magic's in disarray. They don't know what to do. They're trying to keep everything hidden from the Muggles, but meanwhile, Muggles are dying too. Terror everywhere, panic, confusion. That's how it used to be. Well, times like that bring out the best in some people and the worst in others. Crouch's principles might have been good in the beginning. I wouldn't know. He rose quickly through the ministry, and he started ordering very harsh measures against Voldemort's supporters. The Aurors were given new powers to kill rather than capture, for instance. And I wasn't the only one who was handed straight to the Dementors without trial. Crouch fought violence with violence and authorized the use of the unforgivable curse against suspects. I would say he became as ruthless and cruel as many on the dark side. He had his supporters, mind you. Plenty of people thought he was going about things the right way, and there were a lot of witches and wizards clamoring for him to take over as Minister of Magic. When Voldemort disappeared, it looked like only a matter of time until Crouch got the top job, but then something rather unfortunate happened. Sirius smiled grimly. Crouch's own son was caught with a group of Death Eaters who'd managed to talk their way out of Azkaban. Apparently they were trying to find Voldemort and return him to power. Crouch's son was caught? Gasped Hermione. Yep, said Sirius, throwing his chicken bone to Buckbeak, flinging himself back down on the ground beside the loaf of bread and tearing it in half. Nasty little shock for old Barty, I'd imagine. Should have spent a bit more time at home with his family, shouldn't he? Ought to have left the office early once in a while, gotten to know his own son. He began to wolf down large pieces of bread. Was his son a Death Eater? Said Harry. No idea, said Sirius, still stuffing down bread. I was in Azkaban myself when he was brought in. This is mostly stuff I found out since I got out. The boy was definitely caught in the company of people I'd bet my life were Death Eaters, but he might have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, just like the house elf. Did Crouch try and get his son off? Hermione whispered. Sirius let out a laugh that was much more like a bark. Crouch let his son off? I thought you had the measure of him, Hermione. Anything that threatened to tarnish his reputation had to go. He had dedicated his whole life to becoming Minister of Magic. You saw him dismiss a devoted house elf because she associated him with the Dark Mark again. Doesn't that tell you what he's like? Crouch's fatherly affection stretched just far enough to give his son a trial, and by all accounts it wasn't much more than an excuse for Crouch to show how much he hated the boy. Then he sent him straight to Azkaban. He gave his own son to the Dementors? Asked Harry quietly. That's right, said Sirius, and he didn't look remotely amused now. I saw the Dementors bringing him in, watched them through the bars in my cell door. He can't have been more than 19. They took him into a cell near mine. He was screaming for his mother by nightfall. He went quiet after a few days, though. They all went quiet in the end, except when they shrieked in their sleep. For a moment, the deadened look in Sirius's eyes became more pronounced than ever, as though shutters had closed behind them. So he's still in Azkaban, Harry said. No, said Sirius dully. No, he's not there anymore. He died about a year after they brought him in. He died? He wasn't the only one, said Sirius bitterly. Most go mad in there, and plenty stop eating in the end. They lose the will to live. You could always tell when a death was coming because the Dementors could sense it. They got excited. That boy looked pretty sickly when he arrived. Crouch being an important ministry member, he and his wife were allowed a deathbed visit. That was the last time I saw Barty Crouch, half carrying his wife past my cell. She died herself, apparently shortly after. Grief, wasted away, just like the boy. Crouch never came for his son's body. The Dementors buried him outside the fortress. I watched them do it. Sirius threw aside the bread he had just lifted to his mouth, and instead picked up the flask of pumpkin juice and drained it. So old Crouch lost it all, just when he thought he had made it. Just when he thought he had it made, he continued, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. One moment a hero, poised to become Minister of Magic. Next, his son dead, his wife dead, the family name dishonored, and so, I've heard since I escaped, a big drop in popularity. Once the boy had died, people started feeling a bit more sympathetic toward the son and started asking how a nice young lad from a good family had gone so badly astray. The conclusion was that his father never cared much for him, so Cornelius Fudge got the top job, and Crouch was shunted sideways into the Department of International Magical Cooperation. There was a long silence. Harry was thinking of the way Crouch's eyes had bulged as he looked down at his disobedient house elf back in the wood at the Quidditch World Cup. This, then, must have been why Crouch had overreacted to Winky being found beneath the Dark Mark. It had brought back memories of his son and the old scandal and his fall from grace at the Ministry. Moody says Crouch is obsessed with catching dark wizards, Harry told Sirius. Yeah, I've heard it's because a bit of a mania with him, said Sirius, nodding. If you ask me, he still thinks he can bring back the old popularity by catching one more Death Eater. And he sneaked up here to search Snape's office, said Ron triumphantly, looking at Hermione. Yes, and that doesn't make sense at all, said Sirius. Yeah, it does, said Ron excitedly, but Sirius shook his head. Listen, if Crouch wants to investigate Snape, why hasn't he been coming to judge the tournament? It would be an ideal excuse to make regular visits to Hogwarts and keep an eye on him. So you think Snape would be up to something then? Asked Harry, but Hermione broke in. Look, I don't care what you say. Dumbledore trusts Snape. Oh, give it a rest, Hermione, said Ron impatiently. I know Dumbledore is brilliant and everything, but that doesn't mean a really clever dark wizard couldn't fool him. Why did Snape save Harry's life in the first year, then? Why didn't he just let him die? I don't know. Maybe he thought Dumbledore would kick him out. What do you think, Sirius? Harry said loudly, and Ron and Hermione stopped bickering to listen. I think they've both got a point, said Sirius, looking thoughtfully at Ron and Hermione. Ever since I found out Snape was teaching here, I've wondered why Dumbledore hired him. Snape's always been fascinated by the dark arts. He was famous for it at school. Slimy, oily, greasy-haired kid he was, Sirius added, and Harry and Ron grinned at each other. Snape knew more curses when he arrived at school than half the kids in 7th year, and he was part of a gang of Slytherins who nearly all turned out to be Death Eaters. Sirius held up his fingers and began ticking off names. Rosier, Wilkes, They were both killed by Aurors the year before Voldemort fell. The Lestranges, they're a married couple. They're in Azkaban. Avery, from what I've heard, he wormed his way out of trouble by saying he'd been acting under the Imperius Curse. He's still at large. But as far as I know, Snape was never even accused of being a Death Eater. Not that that means much. Plenty of them were never caught, and Snape's certainly clever and cunning enough to keep himself out of trouble. Snape knows Karkaroff pretty well, but he wants to keep that quiet, said Ron. Yeah, you should have seen Snape's face when Karkaroff turned up in potions yesterday, said Harry quickly. Karkaroff wanted to talk to Snape. He says Snape's been avoiding him. Karkaroff looked really worried. He showed Snape something on his arm, but I couldn't see what it was. He showed Snape something on his arm, said Sirius, looking frankly bewildered. He ran his fingers distractedly through his filthy hair, then shrugged again. Well, I've no idea what that's about, but if Karkaroff's genuinely worried, and he's going to Snape for answers. Sirius stared at the cave wall, then made a grimace of frustration. There's still the fact that Dumbledore trusts Snape, and I know Dumbledore trusts where a lot of other people wouldn't, but I just can't see him letting Snape teach at Hogwarts if he'd ever worked for Voldemort. Why are Moody and Crouch so keen to get into Snape's office, then? Said Ron stubbornly. Well, said Sirius slowly, I wouldn't put it past Mad Eye to have searched every single teacher's office when he got to Hogwarts. He takes his defense against the dark arts seriously, Moody. And I'm not sure he trusts anyone at all, and after the things he's seen, it's not surprising. I'll say this for Moody, though. He never killed if he could help it. Always brought people in alive where possible. He was tough, but he never descended to the level of Death Eaters. Crouch, though, he's a different matter. Is he really ill? If he is, why did he make the effort to drag himself up to Snape's office? And if he's not, what's he up to? What was he doing at the World Cup that was so important he didn't turn up in the top box? What's he been doing while he should have been judging the tournament? Sirius lapsed into silence, still staring at the cave wall. Buckbeak was ferreting around on the rocky floor, looking for bones he might have overlooked. Finally, Sirius looked up at Ron. You say your brother's Crouch's personal assistant. Any chance you'd ask him if he's seen Crouch lately? I can try, said Ron doubtfully. Better not make it sound like I reckon Crouch is up to anything dodgy, though. Percy loves Crouch. And you might try and find out whether they've got any leads on Bertha Jorkins while you're at it, said Sirius, gesturing to the second copy of the Daily Prophet. Bagman told me they hadn't, said Harry. Yes, he's quoted in the article in there, said Sirius, nodding at the paper, blustering on about how bad Bertha's memory is. Well, maybe she's changed since I seen her, but the Bertha I knew wasn't forgetful at all. Quite the reverse. She was a bit dim, but she had an excellent memory for gossip. It used to get her into a lot of trouble. She never knew when to keep her mouth shut. I can see her being a bit of a liability at the Ministry of Magic. Maybe that's why Bagman didn't bother to look for her for so long. Sirius heaved an enormous sigh and rubbed his shadowed eyes. What's the time? Harry checked his watch, then remembered it hadn't been working since it had spent an hour in the lake. It's 3:30, said Hermione. You'd better get back to school. Sirius said, getting to his feet. Now listen. He looked particularly hard at Harry. I don't want you lot sneaking out of school to see me, all right? Just send notes to me here. I still want to hear about anything odd, but you're not to go leaving Hogwarts without permission. It would be an ideal opportunity for someone to attack you. No one's tried to attack me so far, except the dragon and a couple of Grindylows, Harry said, but Sirius scowled at him. I don't care. I'll breathe freely again when this tournament's over, and that's not until June. And don't forget, if you're talking about me among yourselves, call me Snuffles, okay? He handed Harry the empty napkin and flask and went to pat Buckbeak goodbye. I'll walk to the edge of the village with you, said Sirius, see if I can scrounge another paper. He transformed into the great black dog before they left the cave, and they walked back down the mountainside with him, across the boulder-strewn ground and back to the stile. Here he allowed each of them to pat him on the head before turning and setting off at a run around the outskirts of the village. Harry, Ron, and Hermione made their way back into Hogsmeade and up toward Hogwarts. Wonder if Percy knows all that stuff about Crouch, Ron said as they walked up the drive to the castle. But maybe he doesn't care. It'd probably just make him admire Crouch even more. Yeah, Percy loves rules. He'd just say Crouch was refusing to break them for his own son. Percy would never throw any of his family to the Dementors, said Hermione severely. I don't know, said Ron. If I thought we were standing in the way of his career... Percy's really ambitious, you know. They walked up the stone steps into the entrance hall, where the delicious smells of dinner wafted toward them from the great hall. Poor old Snuffles, said Ron, breathing deeply. He must really like you, Harry. Imagine having to live off rats. Ugh, I could not imagine living off rats. I just couldn't. That sounds like... I don't know. Doesn't sound too good. It doesn't sound healthy, living like a snake, eating rats. Not for me. I could not do that nonsense. I just definitely could not eat. I couldn't. I bet you if it was probably like life and death and survival and stuff, you probably could, but I just could not imagine myself eating rats. I just couldn't. I don't know. That's just me, though. Alright, Chapter 28 The Madness of Mr. Crouch. Harry, Ron, and Hermione went up to the Owlery after breakfast on Sunday to send a letter to Percy asking, as Sirius had suggested, whether he had seen Mr. Crouch lately. They used Hedwig because it had been so long since she'd had a job. When they had watched her fly out of sight through the Owlery window, they proceeded down to the kitchen to give Dobby his new socks. The house elves gave them a very cheery welcome, bowing and curtsying and bustling around making tea again. Dobby was ecstatic about his present. Harry Potter is too good to Dobby, he squeaked, wiping large tears out of his enormous eyes. You saved my life with that gillyweed, Dobby. You really did, said Harry. No chance of more of those eclairs, is there? Said Ron, who was looking around at the beaming and bowing house elves. You've just had breakfast, said Hermione irritably, but a great silver platter of eclairs was already zooming toward them, supported by 4 elves. We should get some stuff to send up to Snuffles, Harry muttered. Good idea, said Ron. Give Pig something to do. You couldn't give us a bit of extra food, could you? He said to the surrounding elves, and they bowed delightedly and hurried off to get some more. Dobby, where's Winky? Said Hermione, who was looking around. Winky is over there by the fire, miss, said Dobby quietly, his ears drooping slightly. Oh dear, said Hermione as she spotted Winky. Harry looked over at the fireplace too. Winky was sitting on the same stool as last time, but she had allowed herself to become so filthy that she was not immediately distinguishable from the smoke-blackened brick behind her. Her clothes were ragged and unwashed. She was clutching a bottle of butterbeer and swaying slightly on her stool, staring into the fire. As they watched her, she gave an enormous hiccup. Winky is getting through 6 bottles a day now, Dobby whispered to Harry. Well, it's not strong, that stuff, Harry said, but Dobby shook his head. 'Tis strong for a house elf, sir, he said. Winky hiccuped again. The elves who had brought the eclairs gave her disapproving looks as they returned to work. Winky is pining, Harry Potter, Dobby whispered sadly. Winky wants to go home. Winky still thinks Mr. Crouch is her master, sir, and nothing Dobby says will persuade her that Professor Dumbledore is her master now. Hey, Winky, said Harry, struck by a sudden inspiration, walking over to her and bending down. You don't know what Mr. Crouch might be up to, do you? Because he's stopped coming. He stopped turning up to judge the Triwizard Tournament. Winky's eyes flickered. Her enormous pupils focused on Harry. She swayed slightly again and then said, Master has stopped coming? Yes, said Harry. We haven't seen him since the first task. The Daily Prophet's saying he's ill. Winky swayed some more, staring blurrily at Harry. Master ill? Her bottom lip began to tremble. But we're not sure if that's true, said Hermione quickly. Master is needing his... Winky, whimpered the elf. Master cannot manage all by himself. Other people manage to do their own housework, you know, Winky, Hermione said severely. Winky is not only doing housework for Mr. Crouch. Winky squeaked indignantly, swaying worse than ever and slopping butterbeer down her already heavily stained blouse. Master is trusting Winky with the most important, the most secret. What? Said Harry, but Winky shook her head very hard, spilling more butterbeer down herself. Winky keeps her master's secrets, she said mutinously, swaying very heavily now, frowning up at Harry with her eyes crossed. You is nosy. You is. Winky must not talk like that to Harry Potter, said Dobby angrily. Harry Potter is brave and noble, and Harry Potter is not nosy. He is nosing into my master's private and secret. Winky is a good house elf. Winky keeps her silence. People trying to pry and poke. Winky's eyelids drooped, and suddenly, without warning, she slid off her stool into the hearth, snoring loudly. The empty bottle of butterbeer rolled away across the stone-flagged floor. Half a dozen house elves came hurrying forward, looking disgusted. One of them picked up the bottle. The others covered Winky with a large checkered tablecloth and tucked the ends in neatly, hiding her from view. We is sorry you had to see that, sirs and miss, squeaked a nearby elf, shaking his head and looking very ashamed. We is hoping you will not judge us all by Winky, sirs and miss. She's unhappy, said Hermione, exasperated. Why don't you try and cheer her up instead of covering her up? Begging your pardon, miss, said the house elf, bowing deeply again, but house elves has no right to be unhappy when there is work to be done and masters to be served. Oh, for heaven's sake, Hermione cried. Listen to me, all of you. You've got just as much right as wizards to be unhappy. You've got the right to wages and holidays and proper clothes. You don't have to do everything you're told. Look at Dobby. Miss will please keep Dobby out of this, Dobby mumbled, looking scared. The cheering smiles had vanished from the faces of the house elves around the kitchen. They were suddenly looking at Hermione as though she were mad and dangerous. "We has your extra food," squeaked an elf at Harry's elbow, and he shoved a large ham, a dozen cakes, and some fruit into Harry's arms. "Goodbye." The house elves crowded around Harry, Ron, and Hermione and began shunting them out of the kitchen, many little hands pushing in the smalls of their backs. "Thank you for the socks, Harry Potter," Dobby called miserably from the hearth, where he was standing next to the lumpy tablecloth that was Winky. "You couldn't keep your mouth shut, could you, Hermione?" said Ron angrily as the kitchen door slammed shut behind them. "They won't want us visiting them now. We could have tried to get more stuff out of Winky about Crouch." "Oh, as if you care about that," scoffed Hermione. "You only like coming down here for the food." It was an irritable sort of day after that. Harry got so tired of Ron and Hermione sniping at each other over their homework in the common room that he took Sirius's food up to the owlry that evening on his own. Pidgewaggin was much too small to carry an entire ham up to the mountain by himself, so Harry enlisted the help of two school screech owls as well. When they had set off into the dusk, looking extremely odd, carrying the large package between them, Harry leaned on the window sill, looking out at the grounds, at the dark, rustling treetops of the Forbidden Forest, and the rippling sails of the Durmstrang ship. An eagle owl flew through the coil of smoke rising from Hagrid's chimney. It soared toward the castle around the owlry and out of sight. Looking down, Harry saw Hagrid digging energetically in front of his cabin. Harry wondered what he was doing. It looked as though they were making a new vegetable patch. As he watched, Madame Maxim emerged from the Beauxbaton carriage and walked over to Hagrid. She appeared to be trying to engage him in conversation. Hagrid leaned upon his spade, but did not seem keen to prolong their talk, because Madame Maxim returned to the carriage shortly afterward. Unwilling to go back to Gryffindor Tower and listen to Ron and Hermione snarling at each other, Harry watched Hagrid digging until the darkness swallowed him and the owls around Harry. Swallowed him, and the owls around Harry began to awake, swooshing past him into the night. I think there was supposed to be a comma in there somewhere. That sentence was a little run-on to me. By breakfast the next day, Ron's and Hermione's bad moods had burnt out, and to Harry's relief, Ron's dark predictions that the house elves would send substandard food up to the Gryffindor table because Hermione had insulted them proved false. The bacon, eggs, and kippers were quite as good as usual. When the post owls arrived, Hermione looked up eagerly. She seemed to be expecting something. "Percy wouldn't have had time to answer yet," said Ron. "We only sent Hedwig yesterday." "No, it's not that," said Hermione. "I've taken out a subscription to the Daily Prophet. I'm getting sick of finding everything out from the Slytherins." "Good thinking," said Harry, also looking up at the owls. "Hey, Hermione, I think you're in luck." A gray owl was soaring down toward Hermione. "It hasn't got a newspaper, though," she said, looking disappointed. But to her bewilderment, the gray owl landed in front of her plate, closely followed by 4 barn owls, a brown owl, and a tawny. "How many subscriptions did you take out?" said Harry, seizing Hermione's goblet before it was knocked over by the cluster of owls, all of whom were jostling close to her, trying to deliver their own letter first. "What on earth?" Hermione said, taking the letter from the gray owl, opening it, and starting to read. "Oh, really?" she sputtered, going rather red. "What's up?" said Ron. "Oh, how ridiculous." She thrust the letter to Harry, who saw that it was not handwritten, but composed from pasted letters that seemed to have been cut out of the Daily Prophet. "You are a wicked girl. Harry Potter deserves better. Go back where you came from, Muggle." "They're all like it," said Hermione, desperately opening one letter after another. "Harry Potter can do much better than the likes of you. You deserve to be boiled in frog spawn." Ouch. She had opened the last envelope, and yellowish-green liquid, smelling strongly of petrol, gushed over her hands, which began to erupt in large yellow boils. "Undiluted Bubba pus," said Ron, picking up the envelope gingerly and sniffing it. "Ow," said Hermione, tears starting in her eyes as she tried to rub the pus off her hands with a napkin, but her fingers were now so thickly covered in painful sores that it looked as though she were wearing a pair of thick, knobbly gloves. "You better get up to the hospital, Wang," said Harry as the owls around Hermione took flight. "We'll tell Professor Sprout where you've gone." "I warned her," said Ron as Hermione hurried out of the great hall, cradling her hands. "I warned her not to annoy Rita Skeeter. Look at this one." He read out one of the letters Hermione had left behind. "I read in Witch Weekly about how you are playing Harry Potter false, and that boy has had enough hardship, and I will be sending you a curse by next post as soon as I can find a big enough envelope." "Blimey, she better watch out for herself." Hermione didn't turn up for her biology. As Harry and Ron left the greenhouse for their Care of Magical Creatures class, they saw Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle descending the stone steps of the castle. Pansy Parkinson was whispering and giggling behind them with her gang of Slytherin girls. Catching sight of Harry, Pansy called, "Potter, have you split up with your girlfriend? Why was she so upset at breakfast?" Harry ignored her. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing how much trouble the Witch Weekly article had caused. Hagrid, who had told them last lesson that they had finished with unicorns, was waiting for them outside his cabin with a fresh supply of open crates at his feet. Harry's heart sank at the sight of the crates. Surely not another Scroot hatching. But when he got near enough to see inside, he found himself looking at a number of fluffy black creatures with long snouts. Their front paws were curiously flat, like spades, and they were blinking up at the class, looking politely puzzled at all the attention. "They're nifflers," said Hagrid when the class had gathered around. "You find 'em down mines, mostly. They like sparkly stuff. There you go, look." One of the nifflers had suddenly leapt up and attempted to bite Pansy Parkinson's watch off her wrist. She shrieked and jumped backward. "Useful little treasure detectors," said Hagrid happily. "Thought we'd have some fun with 'em today. See over there?" He pointed at the large patch of freshly turned earth Harry had watched him digging from the owlery window. "I've buried some gold coins. I've got a prize for whoever picks the niffler that digs up most. Just take off all your valuables and choose a niffler, and get ready to set 'em loose." Harry took off his watch, which he was only wearing out of habit, as it didn't work anymore, and stuffed it into his pocket. Then he picked up a niffler. It put its long snout in Harry's ear and sniffed enthusiastically. It was really quite cuddly. "Hang on," said Hagrid, looking down into the crate. "There's a spare niffler here. Who's missing?" "Where's Hermione? She had to go to the hospital wing," said Ron. "We'll explain later," Harry muttered. Pansy Parkinson was listening. It was easily the most fun they had ever had in care of magical creatures. The nifflers dived in and out of the patch of earth as though it were water, each scurrying back to the student who had released it and spitting gold into their hands. Ron's was particularly efficient. It had soon filled his lap with coins. "Can you buy these as pets, Hagrid?" he asked excitedly as his niffler dived back into the soil, splattering his robes. "Your mum wouldn't be happy, Ron," said Hagrid, grinning. "They wreck houses, nifflers. I reckon they've nearly got the lot now," he added, pacing around the patch of earth while the nifflers continued to dig. "I only buried 100 coins. Oh, there you are, Hermione." Hermione was walking toward them across the lawn. Her hands were very heavily bandaged, and she looked miserable. Pansy Parkinson was watching her beadily. "Well, let's check how you've done," said Hagrid. "Count your coins, and there's no point trying to steal any, Goyle," he added as Beetle black eyes narrowed. "It's leprechaun gold, vanishes after a few hours." Goyle emptied his pockets, looking extremely sulky. It turned out that Ron's niffler had been most successful, so Hagrid gave him an enormous slab of Honeydukes chocolate for a prize. The bell rang across the grounds for lunch. The rest of the class set off back to the castle, but Harry, Ron, and Hermione stayed behind to help Hagrid put the nifflers back in their boxes. Harry noticed Madame Maxim watching them out of her carriage window. "What have you done to your hands, Hermione?" said Hagrid, looking concerned. Hermione told him about the hate mail she had received that morning and the envelope full of Bubba-Terpapus. Don't worry," said Hagrid gently, looking down at her. "I got some of these letters and all after Rita wrote about me mum. You're a monster and you should be put down. Your mother killed innocent people, and if you had any decency, you'd jump in a lake." "No," said Hermione, looking shocked. "Yes," said Hagrid, heaving the niffler crates over by his cabin wall. "They're just nutters, Hermione. Don't open any if you get any more. Chuck 'em straight in the fire." "You missed a really good lesson," Harry told Hermione as they headed back toward the castle. "They're good, nifflers, aren't they, Ron?" Ron, however, was frowning at the chocolate Hagrid had given him. He looked thoroughly put out about something. "What's the matter?" said Harry. "Wrong flavor?" "No," said Ron shortly. "Why didn't you tell me about the gold?" "What gold?" said Harry. "The gold I gave you at the Quidditch World Cup," said Ron. "The leprechaun gold I gave you for my omnoculars. And the top box. Why didn't you tell me it disappeared?" Harry had to think for a moment before he realized what Ron was talking about. "Oh," he said, the memory coming back to him at last. "I don't know. I never noticed it had gone. I was more worried about my wand, wasn't I?" They climbed the steps into the entrance hall and went into the great hall for lunch. "Must be nice," Ron said abruptly when they had sat down and started serving themselves roast beef and Yorkshire puddings, "to have so much money you don't notice if a pocket full of galleons goes missing." "Listen, I had other stuff on my mind that night," said Harry impatiently. "We all did, remember?" "I didn't know leprechaun gold vanishes," Ron muttered. "I thought I was paying you back. You should have given me that Chudley Cannon hat for Christmas." "Forget it, all right," said Harry. Ron speared a roast potato on the end of his fork, glaring at it. Then he said, "I hate being poor." Harry and Hermione looked at each other. Neither of them really knew what to say. "It's rubbish," said Ron, still glaring down at his potato. "I don't blame Fred and George for trying to make some extra money. Wish I could. Wish I had a niffler." "Well, we know what to get you next Christmas," said Hermione brightly. Then, when Ron continued to look gloomy, She said, "Come on, Ron. It could be worse. At least your fingers aren't full of pus." Hermione was having a lot of difficulty managing her knife and fork. Her fingers were so stiff and swollen. "I hate that Skeeter woman," she burst out savagely. "I'll get her back for this if it's the last thing I do." Hate mail continued to arrive for Hermione over the following week, and although she followed Hagrid's advice and stopped opening it, several of her ill-wishers sent howlers which exploded at the Gryffindor table and shrieked insults at her for the whole hall to hear. Even those people who didn't read Witch Weekly knew all about the supposed Harry, Crumb, Hermione triangle now. Harry was getting sick of telling people that Hermione wasn't his girlfriend. "It'll die down, though," he told Hermione, "if we just ignore it. People got bored with that stuff she wrote about me last time. I want to know how she's listening into private conversation when she's supposed to be banned from the grounds," said Hermione angrily. Hermione hung back in their next Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson and asked Professor Moody something. The rest of the class was very eager to leave. Moody had given them such a rigorous test of hex deflection that many of them were nursing small injuries. Harry had such a bad case of twitchy ears, he had to hold his hands clamped over them as he walked away from the class. "Well, Reed is definitely not using an invisibility cloak," Hermione panted 5 minutes later, catching up with Harry and Ron in the entrance hall and pulling Harry's hand away from one of his wiggling ears so that he could hear her. "Moody says he didn't see her anywhere near the judge's table at the second task, or anywhere near the lake." "Hermione, is there any point in telling you to drop this?" said Ron. "No," said Hermione stubbornly. "I want to know how she heard me talking to Victor, and how she found out about Hagrid's mom." "Maybe she had you bugged," said Harry. "Bugged?" said Ron blankly. "What, put fleas on her or something?" Harry started explaining about hidden microphones and recording equipment. Ron was fascinated, but Hermione interrupted them. "Aren't you two ever going to read Hogwarts a history?" "What's the point?" said Ron. "You know it by heart. We can just ask you. All those substitutes for magic muggles use, electricity, computers, and radar, and all those things, they all go haywire around Hogwarts. There's too much magic in the air. No, Rita's using magic to eavesdrop. She must be. If I could just find out what it is." "Oh, if it's illegal, I'll have her." "Haven't we got enough to worry about?" Ron asked her. "Do we have to start a vendetta against Rita Skeeter as well?" "I'm not asking you to help," Hermione snapped. "I'll do it on my own." She marched back up the marble staircase without a backward glance. Harry was quite sure she was going to the library. "What's the betting she comes back with a box of I Hate Rita Skeeter badges?" said Ron. Hermione, however, did not ask Harry and Ron to help her pursue vengeance against Rita Skeeter, for which they were both grateful, because their workload was mounting even ever higher in the days before the Easter holidays. Harry frankly marveled at the fact that Hermione could research magical methods of eavesdropping, as well as everything else they had to do. He was working flat out just to get through all their homework, though he made a point of sending regular food packages up to the cave in the mountain for Sirius after last summer. Harry had not forgotten what it felt like to be continually hungry. He enclosed notes to Sirius telling him that nothing out of the ordinary had happened and that they were still waiting for an answer from Percy. Sorry guys, I need to get some water. Hedwig didn't return until the end of the Easter holidays. Percy's letter was enclosed in a package of Easter eggs that Mrs. Weasley had sent. Both Harry's and Ron's were the size of dragon eggs and full of homemade toffee. Hermione's, however, was smaller than a chicken egg. Her face fell when she saw it. "Your mum doesn't read Witch Weekly by any chance, does she, Ron?" she asked quietly. "Yeah," said Ron, whose mouth was full of toffee. "Gets it for the recipes." Hermione looked sadly at her tiny egg. "Don't you want to see what Percy's written?" Harry asked her hastily. Percy's letter was short and irritated. "As I am constantly telling the Daily Prophet, Mr. Crouch is taking a well-deserved break. He is sending in regular owls with instructions. No, I haven't actually seen him, but I think I can be trusted to know my own superior's handwriting. I have quite enough to do at the moment without trying to quash these ridiculous rumors. Please don't bother me again unless it's something important. Happy Easter." The start of the summer term would normally have meant that Harry was training hard for the last Quidditch match of the season. This year, however, it was the third and final task in the Triwizard Tournament for which he needed to prepare, but he still didn't know what he would have to do. Finally, in the last week of May, Professor McGonagall held him back in Transfiguration. "You are to go down to the Quidditch field tonight at 9 o'clock, Potter," she told him. "Mr. Bagman will be there to tell the champions about the third task." So at 8:30 that night, Harry left Ron and Hermione in Gryffindor Tower and went downstairs. As he crossed the entrance hall, Cedric came up from Hufflepuff common room. "What do you reckon it's going to be?" he asked Harry as they went together down the stone steps out into the cloudy night. "Fleur keeps going on about underground tunnels. She reckons we've got to find treasure." "That wouldn't be too bad," said Harry, thinking that he would simply ask Hagrid for a Niffler to do the job for him. They walked down the dark lawn to the Quidditch stadium, turned through a gap in the stands, and walked out onto the field. What have they done to it? Cedric said indignantly, stopping dead. The Quidditch field was no longer smooth and flat. It looked as though somebody had been building long, low walls all over it that twisted and crisscrossed in every direction. They're hedges, said Harry, bending to examine the nearest one. Hello there, called a cheery voice. Ludo Bagman was standing in the middle of the field with Krum and Fleur. Harry and Cedric made their way toward them, climbing over the hedges. Fleur beamed at Harry as he came nearer. Her attitude toward him had changed completely since he had saved her sister from the lake. Well, what do you think? Said Bagman happily, as Harry and Cedric climbed over the last hedge. Growing nicely, aren't they? Give them a month and Hagrid will have them 20 feet high. Don't worry, he added, grinning, spotting the less than happy expressions on Harry's and Cedric's faces. You'll have your Quidditch field back to normal once the task is over. Now I imagine you can guess what we're making here. No one spoke for a moment. Then, maze, grunted Krum. That's right, said Bagman. A maze. The third task's really very straightforward. The Triwizard Cup will be placed in the center of the maze. The first champion to touch it will receive full marks. We simply have to get through the maze, said Fleur. There will be obstacles, said Bagman happily, bouncing on the balls of his feet. Hagrid is providing a number of creatures. Then there will be spells that must be broken. All that sort of thing, you know. Now the champions who are leading on points will get a head start into the maze. Bagman grinned at Harry and Cedric. Then Mr. Krum will enter. Then Miss Delacour. But you'll all be in with a fighting chance, depending how well you get past the obstacles. Should be fun, eh? Harry, who knew only too well the kind of creatures that Hagrid was likely to provide for an event like this, thought it was unlikely to be any fun at all. However, he nodded politely, like the other champions. Very well. If you haven't got any questions, we'll go back to the castle, shall we? It's a bit chilly. Bagman hurried alongside Harry as they began to wend their way out of the growing maze. Harry had the feeling that Bagman was going to start offering to help him again, but just then, Krum tapped Harry on the shoulder. Could I have a word? Yeah, all right, said Harry, slightly surprised. Will you walk with me? Okay, said Harry curiously. Bagman looked slightly perturbed. I'll wait for you, Harry, shall I? No, it's okay, Mr. Bagman, said Harry, suppressing a smile. I think I can find the castle on my own, thanks. Harry and Krum left the stadium together, but Krum did not set a course for the Durmstrang ship. Instead, he walked toward the forest. What are we going this way for? Said Harry as they passed Hagrid's cabin and the illuminated Beauxbaton carriage. Don't want to be overheard, said Krum shortly. When at last they had reached a quiet stretch of ground a short way from the Beauxbaton horses' paddock, Krum stopped in the shade of the trees and turned to face Harry. I want to know, he said, glowering, what there is between you and Hermione. Harry, who from Krum's secretive manner had expected something much more serious than this, stared up at Krum in amazement. Nothing, he said, but Krum glowered at him, and Harry, somehow struck anew by how tall Krum was, elaborated. We're friends. She's not my girlfriend, and she never has been. It's just that Skeeter woman making things up. Hermione tells about you very often, said Krum, looking suspiciously at Harry. Yeah, said Harry, because we're friends. He couldn't quite believe he was having this conversation with Victor Krum, the famous international Quidditch player. It was as though the 18-year-old Krum thought he, Harry, was an equal, a real rival. You have not? No, said Harry very firmly. Krum looked slightly happier. He stared at Harry for a few seconds, then said, You fly very well. I was watching at the first task. Thanks, said Harry, grinning broadly and suddenly feeling much taller himself. I saw you at the Quidditch World Cup. The Wronski feint. You really. But something moved behind Krum in the trees, and Harry, who had some experience of the sort of thing that lurked in the forest, instinctively grabbed Krum's arm and pulled him away. What is it? Harry shook his head, staring at the place where he had seen movement. He slipped his hand inside his robes, reaching for his wand. Suddenly, a man staggered out from behind a tall tree. For a moment, Harry didn't recognize him. Then he realized it was Mr. Crouch. He looked as though he had been traveling for days. The knees of his robes were ripped and bloody, his face scratched. He was unshaven and gray with exhaustion. His neat hair and mustache were both in need of a wash and a trim. His strange appearance, however, was nothing to the way he was behaving, muttering and gesticulating. Mr. Crouch appeared to be talking to someone that he alone could see. He reminded Harry vividly of an old tramp he had seen once when out shopping with the Dursleys. That man, too, had been conversing wildly with thin air. Aunt Petunia had seized Dudley's hand and pulled him across the road to avoid him. Uncle Vernon had then treated the family to a long rant about what he would like to do with beggars and vagrants. Wasn't he a judge? Said Krum, staring at Mr. Crouch. Isn't he with your ministry? Harry nodded. hesitated for a moment, then walked slowly toward Mr. Crouch, who did not look at him, but continued to talk to a nearby tree. "And when you've done that, Witherby, send an owl to Dumbledore confirming the number of Durmstrang students who will be attending the tournament. Karkaroff has just sent word there will be 12. Mr. Crouch," said Harry cautiously, "and then send another owl to Madame Maxim because she might want to up the number of students she's bringing now. Karkaroff's made it a round dozen. Do that. Witherby, will you? Will?" Mr. Crouch's eyes were bulging. He stood staring at the tree, muttering soundlessly at it. Then he staggered sideways and fell to his knees. "Mr. Crouch," Harry said loudly, "are you all right?" Crouch's eyes were rolling in his head. Harry looked around at Krum, who had followed him into the trees and was looking down at Crouch in alarm. "What is wrong with him?" "No idea," Harry muttered. "Listen, you'd better go and get someone." "Dumbledore?" gasped Mr. Crouch. He reached out and seized a handful of Harry's robes, dragging him closer, though his eyes were staring over Harry's head. "I need see Dumbledore." "Okay," said Harry. "If you get up, Mr. Crouch, we can go up to the I've done stupid thing." Mr. Crouch breathed. He looked utterly mad. His eyes were rolling and bulging, and a trickle of spittle was sliding down his chin. Every word he spoke seemed to cost a terrible effort. "Must tell Dumbledore." I'm going to start saying that now. Instead of drooling, you're spittling. Mr. Crouch's eyes rolled forward onto Harry. "Who? You?" he whispered. "I'm a student at the school," said Harry, looking around at Krum for some help, but Krum was hanging back, looking extremely nervous. "You're not his," whispered Crouch, his mouth sagging. "No," said Harry, without the faintest idea what Crouch was talking about. "Dumbledore's?" "That's right," said Harry. Crouch was pulling him closer. Harry tried to loosen Crouch's grip on his ropes, but it was too powerful. "Warn Dumbledore." "I'll get Dumbledore if you let go of me," said Harry. "Just let go, Mr. Crouch, and I'll get him." "Thank you, Witherby, and when you have done that, I would like a cup of tea. My wife and son will be arriving shortly, and we are attending a concert tonight with Mr. and Mrs. Fudge." Crouch was now talking fluently to a tree again, and seemed completely unaware that Harry was there, which surprised Harry so much he didn't notice that Crouch had released him. "Yes, my son has recently gained 12 OWLs. Most satisfactory, yes. Thank you. Yes, very proud indeed. Now, if you could bring me that memo from the Endorian Minister of Magic, I think I will have time to draft a response." "You stay here with him," Harry said to Krum. "I'll get Dumbledore. I'll be quicker. I know where his office is." "He is mad," said Krum doubtfully, staring down at Crouch, who was still gabbling to the tree, apparently convinced it was Percy. "Just stay with him," said Harry, starting to get up, but his movement seemed to trigger another abrupt change in Mr. Crouch, who seized him hard around the knees and pulled Harry back to the ground. "Don't leave me," he whispered, his eyes bulging again. "I escaped. Must warn. Must tell. See Dumbledore. My fault. All my fault. Bertha. Dead. All my fault. My son. My fault. Tell Dumbledore. Harry Potter. The Dark Lord. Stronger. Harry Potter." "I'll get Dumbledore if you let me go, Mr. Crouch," said Harry. He looked furiously around at Krum. "Help me, will you?" Looking extremely apprehensive, Krum moved forward and squatted down next to Mr. Crouch. "Just keep him here," said Harry, pulling himself free of Mr. Crouch. "I'll be back with Dumbledore." "Hurry, won't you?" Krum called after him as Harry sprinted away from the forest and up through the dark grounds. They were deserted. Bagman, Cedric, and Flora disappeared. Harry tore up the stone steps, through the oak front doors, and off up the marble staircase toward the second floor. 5 minutes later, he was hurtling toward a stone gargoyle standing halfway along an empty corridor. "Sherbert Lemon," he panted at it. This was the password to the hidden staircase to Dumbledore's office, or at least it had been 2 years ago. The password had evidently changed, however, for the stone gargoyle did not spring to life and jump aside, but stood frozen, glaring at Harry malevolently. "Move!" Harry shouted at him. "Come on!" But nothing at Hogwarts had ever moved just because he shouted at it. He knew it was no good. He looked up and down the dark corridor. Perhaps Dumbledore was in the staff room. He started running as fast as he could toward the staircase. "Potter!" Harry skidded to a halt and looked around. Snape had just emerged from the hidden staircase behind the stone gargoyle. The wall was sliding shut behind him, even as he beckoned Harry back toward him. "What are you doing here, Potter?" "I need to see Professor Dumbledore," said Harry, running back up the corridor and skidding to a standstill in front of Snape instead. "It's Mr. Crouch. He's just turned up. He's in the forest. He's asking—" "What is this rubbish?" said Snape, his black eyes glittering. "What are you talking about?" "Mr. Crouch," Harry shouted, "from the Ministry. He's ill or something. He's in the forest. He wants to see Dumbledore. Just give me the password up to—" "The headmaster is busy, Potter," said Snape, his thin mouth curling into an unpleasant smile. "I've got to tell Dumbledore," Harry yelled. "Didn't you hear me, Potter?" Harry could tell Snape was thoroughly enjoying himself, denying Harry the thing he wanted when he was so panicky. "Look," said Harry angrily, "Crouch isn't right. He's out of his mind. He says he wants to warn—" The stone wall behind Snape slid open. Dumbledore was standing there, wearing long green robes and a mildly curious expression. "Is there a problem?" he said, looking between Harry and Snape. "Professor," Harry said, sidestepping Snape before Snape could speak, "Mr. Crouch is here. He's down in the forest. He wants to speak to you." Harry expected Dumbledore to ask questions, but to his relief, Dumbledore did nothing of the sort. "Lead the way," he said promptly, and he swept off along the corridor behind Harry, leaving Snape standing next to the gargoyle and looking twice as ugly. "What did Mr. Crouch say, Harry?" said Dumbledore as they walked swiftly down the marble staircase. "Said he wants to warn you. Said he's done something terrible. He mentioned his son and Bertha Jorkins and Voldemort. Something about Voldemort getting stronger." "Indeed," said Dumbledore, and he quickened his pace as they hurried out into the pitch darkness. "He's not acting normally," Harry said, hurrying along beside Dumbledore. "He doesn't seem to know where he is. He keeps talking like he thinks Percy Weasley's there, and then he changes and says he needs to see you. I left him with Victor Crumb." "You did?" said Dumbledore sharply, and he began to take longer strides still, so that Harry was running to keep up. "Do you know if anybody else saw Mr. Crouch?" "No," said Harry. "Crumb and I were talking. Mr. Bagman had just finished telling us about the third task. We stayed behind, and then we saw Mr. Crouch coming out of the forest." "Where are they?" said Dumbledore as the Beauxbaton carriages emerged from the darkness. "Over here," said Harry, moving in front of Dumbledore, leading the way through the trees. He couldn't hear Crouch's voice anymore, but he knew where he was going. It hadn't been much past the Beauxbaton carriage. "Somewhere around here." "Victor!" Harry shouted. No answer. "They were here," Harry said to Dumbledore. "They were definitely somewhere around here." "Lumos," Dumbledore said, lighting his wand and holding it up. Its narrow beam traveled from black trunk to black trunk, illuminating the ground, and then it fell upon a pair of feet. Harry and Dumbledore hurried forward. Crumb was sprawled on the forest floor. He seemed to be unconscious. There was no sign at all of Mr. Crouch. Dumbledore bent over Crumb and gently lifted one of his eyelids. "Stunned," he said softly. His half-moon glasses glinted in the wand light as he peered around at the surrounding trees. "Should I go and get someone?" said Harry. "Madame Pomfrey?" "No," said Dumbledore swiftly. "Stay here." He raised his wand into the air and pointed it in the direction of Hagrid's cabin. Harry saw something silvery dart out of it and streak away through the trees like a ghostly bird. Then Dumbledore bent over Crumb again, pointed his wand at him, and muttered, "Enervate." Crumb opened his eyes. He looked dazed. When he saw Dumbledore, he tried to sit up, but Dumbledore put a hand on his shoulder and made him lie still. "He attacked me," Crumb muttered, putting a hand up to his head. "The old madman attacked me. I was looking around to see where Potter had gone, and he attacked from behind." "Lie still for a moment," Dumbledore said. The sound of thunderous footfalls reached them, and Hagrid came panting into sight with Fang at his heels. He was carrying his crossbow. "Professor Dumbledore," he said, his eyes widening. "Harry, what the—" "Hagrid, I need you to fetch Professor Karkaroff," said Dumbledore. His student has been attacked, his student has been attacked. When you've done that, kindly alert Professor Moody." "No need, Dumbledore," said a wheezy growl. "I'm here." Moody was limping toward them, leaning on his staff, his wand lit. "Damn leg," he said furiously. "Would have been here quicker. What's happened?" "Snape said something about Crouch." "Crouch," said Hagrid blankly. "Karkaroff, please." "Hagrid," said Dumbledore sharply. "Oh, yeah, right. Yar, Professor," said Hagrid, and he turned and disappeared into the dark trees, Fang trotting after him. "I don't know where Barty Crouch is," Dumbledore told Moody, "but it is essential that we find him." "I'm on to it," growled Moody, and he pulled out his wand and limped off into the forest. Neither Dumbledore nor Harry spoke again until they heard the unmistakable sounds of Hagrid and Fang returning. Karkaroff was hurrying along behind them. He was wearing his sleek silver furs, and he looked pale and agitated. "What is this?" he cried when he saw Crumb on the ground and Dumbledore and Harry beside him. "What's going on?" "I was attacked," said Crumb, sitting up now and rubbing his head. "Mr. Crouch, or whatever his name." "Crouch attacked you? Crouch attacked you? The Triwizard Judge?" "Igor," Dumbledore began, but Karkaroff had drawn himself up, clutching his furs around him, looking livid. "Treachery," he bellowed, pointing at Dumbledore. "It is a plot. You and your Ministry of Magic have lured me here under false pretenses, Dumbledore. This is not an equal competition. First you sneak Potter into the tournament, though he is underage. Now one of your Ministry friends attempts to put my champion out of the action. I smell double-dealing and corruption in this whole affair. And you, Dumbledore, you, with your talk of closer international wizarding links, of rebuilding old ties, of forgetting old differences. Here's what I think of you." Karkaroff spat onto the ground at Dumbledore's feet. In one swift movement, Hagrid seized the front of Karkaroff's furs, lifted him into the air, and slammed him against a nearby tree. "Apologize," Hagrid snarled as Karkaroff gasped for breath. Hagrid's massive fist at his throat, his feet dangling in midair. "Hagrid? No!" Dumbledore shouted, his eyes flashing. Hagrid removed the hand pinning Karkaroff to the tree, and Karkaroff slid all the way down the trunk and slumped in a huddle at its roots. A few twigs and leaves showered down upon his head. "Kindly escort Harry back up to the castle, Hagrid," said Dumbledore sharply. Breathing heavily, Hagrid gave Karkaroff a glowering look. "Maybe I'd better stay here, Headmaster." "You will take Harry back to school, Hagrid," Dumbledore repeated firmly. "Take him right up to Gryffindor Tower. And Harry, I want you to stay there. Anything you might want to do, any owls you might want to send, they can wait until morning. Do you understand me?" Yes," said Harry, staring at him. How would Dumbledore known that at that very moment he had been thinking about sending Pigwidgeon straight to Sirius to tell him what had happened? "I'll leave Fang with you, Headmaster," Hagrid said, staring menacingly at Karkaroff, who was still sprawled at the foot of the tree, tangled in furs and tree roots. "Stay, Fang. Come on, Harry." They marched in silence past the Beauxbaton carriage and up toward the castle. "How dare he?" Hagrid growled as they strode past the lake. "How dare he accuse Dumbledore? Like Dumbledore'd do anything like that. Like Dumbledore wanted you in the tournament in the first place. Worried. I don't know when I've seen Dumbledore more worried than he's been lately. And you," Hagrid suddenly said angrily to Harry, who looked up at him, taken aback. "What were you doing wandering off with Ruddy Crumb? He's from Durmstrang, Harry. Could have jinxed you right there, couldn't he? Hasn't Moody taught you nothing? Imagine letting him lure you off on your own." "Crumb's all right," said Harry, as they climbed the steps into the entrance hall. "He wasn't trying to jinx me. He just wanted to talk about Hermione. I'll be having a few words with her and all," said Hagrid grimly, stomping up the stairs. "The less you lot have to deal with these foreigners, the happier you'll be. You can trust any of 'em." "You were getting on all right with Madame Maxim," Harry said, annoyed. "Don't you talk about me and her," said Hagrid, and he looked quite frightening for a moment. "I've got her number now, trying to get back in me good books, trying to get me to tell her what's coming in the third task. Ha, you can trust any of 'em." Hagrid was in such a bad mood, Harry was quite glad to say goodbye to him in front of the fat lady. He clambered through the portrait hole into the common room and hurried straight for the corner where Ron and Hermione were sitting to tell them what had happened. Man, it's getting tense. It's getting tense. Now, let me see how many pages we have for this next chapter. It looks like we're pretty good. Chapter 29, The Dream. "It comes down to this," said Hermione, rubbing her forehead. "Either Mr. Crouch attacked Victor, or somebody else attacked both of them when Victor wasn't looking." "It must have been Crouch," said Ron at once. "That's why he was gone when Harry and Dumbledore got there. He'd done a runner." "I don't think so," said Harry, shaking his head. "He seemed really weak. I don't reckon he was up to disapparating or anything." "You can't disapparate on the Hogwarts grounds. Haven't I told you enough times?" said Hermione. "Okay, how's this for a theory?" said Ron excitedly. "Crumb attacked Crouch. No, wait for a minute, and then stunned himself." "And Mr. Crouch evaporated, did he?" said Hermione coldly. "Oh, yeah. It was daybreak. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had crept out of their dormitories very early and hurried up to the Owlery together to send a note to Sirius. Neither were standing looking out at the misty grounds. All three of them were puffy-eyed and pale because they had been talking late into the night about Mr. Crouch. "Just go through it again, Harry," said Hermione. "What did Mr. Crouch actually say?" "I've told you. He wasn't making much sense," said Harry. "He said he wanted to warn Dumbledore about something. He definitely mentioned Bertha Jorkins, and he seemed to think she was dead. He kept saying stuff was his fault. He mentioned his son." "Well, that was his fault," said Hermione testily. "He was out of his mind," said Harry. "Half the time he seemed to think his wife and son were still alive, and he kept talking to Percy about work and giving him instructions." "And remind me what he said about you-know-who," said Ron tentatively. "I've told you," Harry repeated dully. "He said he's getting stronger." There was a pause. Then Ron said in a falsely confident voice, "But he was out of his mind, like you said, so half of it was probably just raving. He was a sanist when he was trying to talk about Voldemort," said Harry, and Ron winced at the sound of the name. "He was having real trouble stringing two words together, but that was when he seemed to know where he was, and know what he wanted to do. He just kept saying he had to see Dumbledore." Harry turned away from the window and stared up into the rafters. The many perches were half empty. Every now and then another owl would swoop in through one of the windows, returning from its night's hunting with a mouse in its beak. "If Snape hadn't held me up," Harry said bitterly, "we might have got there in time. The headmaster is busy, Potter. What's this rubbish, Potter? Why couldn't he have just got out of the way?" "Maybe he didn't want you to get there," said Ron quickly. "Maybe. Hang on. How fast do you reckon he could have gotten down to the forest? Do you reckon he could have beaten you and Dumbledore there?" "Not unless he can turn himself into a bat or something," said Harry. "Wouldn't put it past him," Ron muttered. "We need to see Professor Moody," said Hermione. "We need to find out whether he found Mr. Crouch. If he had the Marauder's map on him, it would have been easy." said Harry. "Unless Crouch was already outside the grounds," said Ron, "because it only shows up to the boundaries, doesn't it?" "Shush," said Hermione suddenly. Somebody was climbing the steps up to the Owlery. Harry could hear two voices arguing, coming closer and closer. "That's blackmail, that is. We could get into a lot of trouble for that. We've tried being polite. It's time to play dirty, like him. He wouldn't like the Ministry of Magic knowing what he did. I'm telling you, if you put that in writing, it's blackmail. Yeah, and you won't be complaining if we get a nice fat payoff, will you?" The Owlery door banged open. Fred and George came over the threshold, then froze at the sight of Harry, Ron, and Hermione. "What are you doing here?" Ron and Fred said at the same time. "Sending a letter," said Harry and George in unison. "What, at this time?" said Hermione and Fred. Fred grinned. "Fine, we won't ask you what you're doing if you don't ask us," he said. He was holding a sealed envelope in his hands. Harry glanced at it, but Fred, whether accidentally or on purpose, shifted his hand so that the name on it was covered. "Well, don't let us hold you up," Fred said, making a mock bow and pointing at the door. Ron didn't move. "Who are you blackmailing?" he said. The grin vanished from Fred's face. Harry saw George half glance at Fred before smiling at Ron. "Don't be stupid. I was only joking," he said easily. "Didn't sound like that," said Ron. Fred and George looked at each other. Then Fred said abruptly, "I've told you before, Ron, to keep your nose out if you like it the shape it is. Can't see why you would, but it's my business if you're blackmailing someone," said Ron. "George is right. You could end up in serious trouble for that." "Told you I was joking," said George. He walked over to Fred, pulled the letter out of his hands, and began attaching it to the leg of the nearest barn owl. "You're starting to sound a bit like our dear older brother, you are, Ron. Carry on like this, and you'll be made a prefect." "No, I won't," said Ron hotly. George carried the barn owl over to the window, and it took off. George turned around and grinned at Ron. "Well, stop telling people what to do then. See you later." He and Fred left the Owlery. Harry, Ron, and Hermione stared at one another. "You don't think they know something about all this, do you?" Hermione whispered. "About Crouch and everything?" "No," said Harry. "If it was something that serious, they'd tell someone. They'd tell Dumbledore." Ron, however, was looking uncomfortable. "What's the matter?" Hermione asked him. "Well," said Ron slowly, "I don't know if they would. They're obsessed with making money lately. I noticed it when I was hanging around them when, we weren't talking." Harry finished the sentence for him. "Yeah, but blackmail? It's this joke shop idea they've got," said Ron. "I thought they were only saying it to annoy Mom, but they really mean it. They want to start one. They've only got a year left at Hogwarts. They keep going on about how it's time to think about their future, and Dad can't help them, and they need gold to get started." Hermione was looking uncomfortable now. "Yes, but they wouldn't do anything against the law to get gold, wouldn't they?" said Ron, looking skeptical. "I don't know. They don't exactly mind breaking rules, do they?" "Yes, but this is the law," said Hermione, looking scared. "This isn't some silly school rule. They'll get a lot more than detention for blackmail. Ron, maybe you'd better tell Percy." "Are you mad?" said Ron. "Tell Percy? He'd probably do a crouch and turn them in." He stared at the window through which Fred and George's owl had departed, then said, "Come on, let's get some breakfast." "Do you think it's too early to go and see Professor Moody?" Hermione said as they went down the spiral staircase. "Yes," said Harry. "He'd probably blast us through the door if we wake him at the crack of dawn. He'll think we're trying to attack him while he's asleep. Let's give it till break." History of Magic had barely gone so slowly. Harry kept checking Ron's watch, having finally discarded his own, but Ron's was moving so slowly he could have sworn it had stopped working too. All three of them were so tired they could happily have put their heads down on the desks and slept. Even Hermione wasn't taking her usual notes, but was sitting with her head on her hand, gazing at Professor Binns with her eyes out of focus. When the bell finally rang, they hurried out into the corridors toward the dark arts classroom and found Professor Moody leaving it. He looked as tired as they felt. The eyelid of his normal eye was drooping, giving his scar an even more lopsided appearance than usual. "Professor Moody," Harry called as they made their way toward him through the crowd. "Hello, Potter," growled Moody. His magical eye followed a couple of passing first-years who sped up, looking nervous. It rolled back into the back of Moody's head and watched them around the corner before he spoke again. "Come in here." He stood back to let them into his empty classroom, limped in after them, and closed the door. "Did you find him?" Harry asked without preamble. "Mr. Crouch." "No," said Moody. He moved over to his desk, sat down, stretched out his wooden leg with a slight groan, and pulled out his hip flask. "Did you use the map?" Harry asked. "Of course," said Moody, taking a swig from his flask. "Took a leaf out of your book, Potter. Summoned it from my office into the forest. He wasn't anywhere on there." "So he did disapparate," said Ron. "You can't disapparate on the grounds, Ron," said Hermione. "There are other ways he could have disappeared, aren't there, Professor?" Moody's magical eye quivered as it rested on Hermione. "You're another one who might think about a career as an aura," he told her. "Mind works the right way, Granger." Hermione flushed, pink with pleasure. Well, he wasn't invisible, said Harry. The map shows invisible people. He must have left the grounds then. But under whose own stem? Said Hermione eagerly. Or because someone made him. Yeah, someone could have. Could have pulled him onto a broom and flown him off with him, couldn't they? Said Ron quickly, looking hopefully at Moody, as if he too wanted to be told he had the makings of an aura. We can't rule out kidnap, growled Moody. So, said Ron, do you reckon he's somewhere in Hogsmeade? Could be anywhere, said Moody, shaking his head. Only thing we know for sure is that he's not here. He yawned widely, so that his scars stretched and his lopsided mouth revealed a number of missing teeth. Then he said, Now Dumbledore's told me you three fancy yourselves as investigators, but there's nothing you can do for Crouch. The Ministry will be looking for him now. Dumbledore's notified them. Potter, you just keep your mind on the third task. What? Said Harry. Oh, yeah. He hadn't given the maze a single thought since he'd left it with Crumb the previous night. Should be right up your street, this one, said Moody, looking up at Harry and scratching his scarred and stubbly chin. From what Dumbledore said, you've managed to get through stuff like this plenty of times. Broke your way through a series of obstacles guarding the Sorcerer's Stone in your first year, didn't you? We helped, Ron said quickly. Me and Hermione helped. Moody grinned. Well, help him practice for this one, and I'll be very surprised if he doesn't win, said Moody. In the meantime, constant vigilance, Potter. Constant vigilance. He took another long draw from his hip flask, and his magical eyes swiveled onto the window. The topmost sail of the Durmstrang ship was visible through it. You two, counseled Moody, his normal eye on Ron and Hermione. You stick close to Potter, all right? I'm keeping an eye on things, but all the same, you can never have too many eyes out. Sirius sent their owl back the very next morning. It fluttered down beside Harry at the same moment that a tawny owl landed in front of Hermione, clutching a copy of the Daily Prophet in its beak. She took the newspaper, scanned the first few pages, said, Ha! She hasn't got wind of Crouch, then joined Ron and Harry in reading what Sirius had to say on the mysterious events of the night before last. Harry, what do you think you are playing at? Walking off into the forest with Victor Crumb. I want you to swear by Return Owl that you are not going to go walking with anyone else at night. There is somebody highly dangerous at Hogwarts. It is clear to me that they want... It is clear to me that they wanted to stop Crouch from seeing Dumbledore, and you were probably feet away from them in the dark. You could have been killed. Your name didn't get into the Goblet of Fire by accident. If someone's trying to attack you, they're on their last chance. Stay close to Ron and Hermione. Do not leave Gryffindor Tower after hours, and arm yourself for the third task. Practice stunning and disarming. A few hexes wouldn't go amiss either. There's nothing you can do about Crouch. Keep your head down and look after yourself. I'm waiting for your letter giving me your word you won't stray out of bounds again. Sirius. Who's he to lecture me about being out of bounds? Said Harry in mild indignation as he folded up Sirius's letter and put it inside his robes. After all the stuff he did at school. He's worried about you, said Hermione sharply, just like Moody and Hagrid, so listen to them. No one's tried to attack me all year, said Harry. No one's done anything to me at all, except put your name in the Goblet of Fire, said Hermione. And they must have done that for a reason, Harry. Snuffles is right. Maybe they've been biding their time. Maybe this is the task they're going to get you. Look, said Harry impatiently, let's say Sirius is right, and someone stunned Crumb to kidnap Crouch. Well, they would have been in the trees near us, wouldn't they? But they waited till I was out of the way until they acted, didn't they? So it doesn't look like I'm their target, does it? They couldn't have made it look like an accident if they'd murdered you in the forest, said Hermione, but if you died during a task. They didn't care about attacking Crumb, did they? Said Harry. Why didn't they just polish me off at the same time? They could have made it look like Crumb and I had a duel or something. Harry, I don't understand it either, said Hermione desperately. I just know there are a lot of odd things going on, and I don't like it. Moody's right. Sirius is right. You've got to get in training for the third task straight away, and you make sure you wire back to Sirius and promise him you're not going to go sneaking off alone again. The Hogwarts grounds never looked more inviting than when Harry had to stay indoors. For the next few days, he spent all of his free time either in the library with Hermione and Ron, looking up hexes, or else in empty classrooms, which they sneaked into to practice. Harry was concentrating on the stunning spell, which he had never used before. The trouble was that practicing it involved certain sacrifices on Ron's and Hermione's part. Can't we kidnap Mrs. Norris? Ron suggested on Monday lunchtime as he lay flat on his back in the middle of their charms classroom, having just been stunned and reawoken by Harry for the 5th time in a row. Let's stun her for a bit. Or you could use Dobby. Harry, I bet he'd do anything to help you. I'm not complaining or anything. He got gingerly to his feet, rubbing his backside, but I'm aching all over. Well, you keep missing the cushions, don't you? Said Hermione, impatiently rearranging the pile of cushions they had used for the banishing spell. which Flitwick had left in a cabinet. "Just try and fall backward. Once you're stunned, you can't aim too well, Hermione," said Ron angrily. "Why don't you take a turn?" "Well, I think Harry's got it now, anyway," said Hermione hastily, "and we don't have to worry about disarming, because he's been able to do that for ages. I think we ought to start on some of these hexes this evening." She looked down the list they had made in the library. "I like the look of this one," she said. "This impediment curse should slow down anything that's trying to attack you, Harry. We'll start with that one." The bell rang. They hastily shoved the cushions back into Flitwick's cupboard and slipped out of the classroom. "See you at dinner," said Hermione, and she set off for arithmancy, while Harry and Ron headed toward North Tower and divination. Broad strips of dazzling gold sunlight fell across the corridor from the high windows. The sky outside was so brightly blue it looked as though it had been enameled. "It's going to be boiling in Trelawney's room. She never puts out that fire," said Ron as they started up the staircase toward the silver ladder and the trapdoor. He was quite right. The dimly lit room was sweltering hot. The fumes from the perfumed fire were heavier than ever. Harry's head swam as he made his way over to one of the curtained windows. While Professor Trelawney was looking the other way, disentangled her shawl from a lamp, he opened it an inch or so and settled back in his chintz armchair so that a soft breeze played across his face. It was extremely comfortable. "My dears," said Professor Trelawney, sitting down in her winged armchair in front of the class and peering around at them all with her strangely enlarged eyes, "we have almost finished our work on planetary divination. Today, however, will be an excellent opportunity to examine the effects of Mars, for he is placed most interestingly at the present time. If you will all look this way, I will dim the lights." She waved her wand and the lamps went out. The fire was the only source of light now. Professor Trelawney bent down and lifted from under her chair a miniature model of the solar system, contained within a glass dome. It was a beautiful thing, each of the moons glimmering in place around the 9 planets, and the fiery sun, all of them hanging in thin air beneath the glass. Harry watched lazily as Professor Trelawney began to point out the fascinating angle Mars was making to Neptune. The heavily perfumed fumes washed over him, and the breeze from the window played across his face. He could hear an insect humming gently somewhere behind the curtain. His eyelids began to droop. He was riding on the back of an eagle owl, soaring through the clear blue sky toward an old ivy-covered house set high on a hillside. Lower and lower they flew, the wind blowing pleasantly in Harry's face, until they reached a dark and broken window in the upper story of the house and entered. Now they were flying along a gloomy passageway to a room at the very end. Through the door they went, into a dark room whose windows were boarded up. Harry had left the owl's back. He was watching now as it fluttered across the room into a chair with its back to him. There were 2 dark shapes on the floor beside the chair. Both of them were stirring. One was a huge snake, the other was a man. A short, balding man, a man with watery eyes and a pointed nose. He was wheezing and sobbing on the hearth rug. "You are in luck, Wormtail," said a cold, high-pitched voice from the depths of the chair in which the owl had landed. "You are very fortunate indeed. Your blunder has not ruined everything. He is dead." "My lord," gasped the man on the floor, "my lord, I am so pleased, and so sorry." "Nagini," said the cold voice, "you are out of luck. I will not be feeding Wormtail to you after all. But never mind, never mind. There is still Harry Potter." The snake hissed. Harry could see its tongue fluttering. "Now, Wormtail," said the cold voice, "perhaps one more little reminder why I will not tolerate another blunder from you." "My lord, no, I beg you." The tip of a wand emerged from around the back of the chair. It was pointing at Wormtail. "Crucio," said the cold voice. Wormtail screamed as though every nerve in his body were on fire. The screaming filled Harry's ears as the scar on his forehead seared with pain. He was yelling too. Voldemort would hear him, would know he was there. "Harry! Harry!" Harry opened his eyes. He was lying on the floor of Professor Trelawney's room with his hands over his face. His scar was still burning so badly that his eyes were watering. The pain had been real. The whole class was standing around him, and Ron was kneeling next to him, looking terrified. "You all right?" he said. "Of course he isn't," said Professor Trelawney, looking thoroughly excited. Her great eyes loomed over Harry, gazing at him. "What was it, Potter? A premonition? An apparition? What did you see?" "Nothing," Harry lied. He sat up. He could feel himself shaking. He couldn't stop himself from looking around into the shadows behind him. Voldemort's voice had sounded so close. "You were clutching your scar," said Professor Trelawney. "You were rolling on the floor, clutching your scar. Come now, Potter. I have experience in these matters." Harry looked up at her. "I need to go to the hospital wing, I think," he said. "Bad headache." "My dear, you are undoubtedly stimulated by the extraordinary clairvoyant vibrations of my room," said Professor Trelawney. "If you leave now, you may lose the opportunity to see further than you have ever—" "I don't want to see anything except a headache cure," said Harry. He stood up. The class backed away. They all looked unnerved. "See you later," Harry muttered to Ron, and he picked up his bag and headed for the trapdoor, ignoring Professor Trelawney, who was wearing an expression of great frustration, as though she had just been denied a real treat. When Harry reached the bottom of her stepladder, however, he did not set off for the hospital wing. He had no intention whatsoever of going there. Sirius had told him what to do if his scar hurt him again, and Harry was going to follow his advice. He was going straight to Dumbledore's office. He marched down the corridors, thinking about what he had seen in the dream. It had been as vivid as the one that had awoken him on Privet Drive. He ran over the details in his mind, trying to make sure he could remember them. He had heard Voldemort accusing Wormtail of making a blunder, but the owl had brought good news. The blunder had been repaired. Somebody was dead, so Wormtail was not going to be fed to the snake. He, Harry, was going to be fed to it instead. Harry had walked right past the stone gargoyle guarding the entrance to Dumbledore's office without noticing. He blinked, looked around, realized what he had done, and retraced his steps, stopping in front of it. Then he remembered that he didn't know the password. "Sherbet lemon?" he tried tentatively. The gargoyle did not move. "Okay," said Harry, staring at it. "Pear drop. Licorice wand. Fizzing Wisby. Dribble's best blowing gum. Bertie Bott's every flavor beans. Oh no, he doesn't like them, does he?" "Oh, just open, can't you?" he said angrily. "I really need to see him. It's urgent." The gargoyle remained immovable. Harry kicked it, achieving nothing but an excruciating pain in his big toe. "Chocolate frog," he yelled angrily, standing on one leg. "Sugar quill. Cockroach cluster." The gargoyle sprang to life and jumped aside. Harry blinked. "Cockroach cluster?" he said, amazed. "I was only joking." He hurried through the gap in the walls and stepped onto the foot of a spiral stone staircase, which moved slowly upward as the doors closed behind him, taking him up to a polished oak door with a brass door knocker. He could hear voices from inside the office. He stepped off the moving staircase and hesitated, listening. "Dumbledore, I'm afraid I don't see the connection. Don't see it at all." It was the voice of the Minister of Magic, Cornelius Fudge. "Leto says Bertha's perfectly capable of getting herself lost. I agree we would have expected to have found her by now, but all the same, we've no evidence of foul play. Dumbledore, none at all. As for her disappearance being linked with Barty Crouch's..." "And what do you think's happened to Barty Crouch, Minister?" said Moody's growling voice. "I see two possibilities, Alistair," said Fudge. "Either Crouch has finally cracked, more than likely, I'm sure you'll agree, given his personal history, lost his mind and gone wandering off somewhere. He wandered extremely quickly, if that is the case, Cornelius," said Dumbledore calmly. "Or else, well..." Fudge sounded embarrassed. "Well, I'll reserve judgment until after I've seen the place where he was found. But you say it was just past the Beauxbatons carriage. Dumbledore, you know what that woman is? I consider her to be a very able headmistress and an excellent dancer," said Dumbledore quietly. "Dumbledore, come," said Fudge angrily. "Don't you think you might be prejudiced in her favor because of Hagrid? They don't all turn out harmless, if, indeed, you can call Hagrid harmless, with that monster fixation he's got." "I no more suspect Madame Maxim than Hagrid," said Dumbledore just as calmly. "I think it possible that it is you who are prejudiced, Cornelius." "Can we wrap up this discussion?" growled Moody. Yes, let's go down to the grounds then," said Fudge impatiently. "No, it's not that," said Moody. "It's just that Potter wants a word with you, Dumbledore. He's just outside the door." I like Moody. He seems to find everything, like he knows every single thing going on everywhere at all times. It's pretty cool to me, I think. Anyways, that's just me, though. Let's see. I think we can read one more. Chapter 30, The Pensieve. The door of the office opened. "Hello, Potter," said Moody. "Come in, then." Harry walked inside. He had been inside Dumbledore's office once before. It was a very beautiful circular room, lined with pictures of previous headmasters and headmistresses of Hogwarts, all of whom were fast asleep, their chests rising and falling gently. Cornelius Fudge was standing beside Dumbledore's desk, wearing his usual pin-striped cloak and holding his lime-green boiler hat. "Harry," said Fudge jovially, moving forward, "how are you?" "Fine," Harry lied. "We were just talking about the night when Mr. Crouch turned up on the grounds," said Fudge. "It was you who found him, was it not?" "Yes," said Harry. Then, feeling it was pointless to pretend that he hadn't overheard what they had been saying, he added, "I didn't see Madame Maxim anywhere, though, and she'd have a job hiding, wouldn't she?" Dumbledore smiled at Harry behind Fudge's back, his eyes twinkling. "Yes, well," said Fudge, looking embarrassed, "we're about to go for a short walk on the grounds. Harry, if you'll excuse us, perhaps if you just go back to your class." "I wanted to talk to you, Professor," Harry said quickly, looking at Dumbledore, who gave him a swift, searching look. "Wait here for me, Harry," he said. "Our examination of the grounds will not take long." They trooped out in silence past him and closed the door. After a minute or so, Harry heard the clunks of Moody's wooden leg growing fainter in the corridor below. He looked around. "Hello, Fawkes," he said. Fawkes, Professor Dumbledore's phoenix, was standing on his golden perch beside the door, the size of a swan with magnificent scarlet and gold plumage. He swished his long tail and blinked benignly at Harry. Harry sat down in a chair in front of Dumbledore's desk. For several minutes he sat and watched the old headmasters and headmistresses snoozing in their frames, thinking about what he had just heard and running his fingers over his scar. It had stopped hurting now. He felt much calmer, somehow, now that he was in Dumbledore's office, knowing he would shortly be telling him about the dream. Harry looked up at the walls behind the desk. The patched and ragged sorting hat was standing on a shelf. A glass case next to it held a magnificent silver sword with large rubies set into the hilt, which Harry recognized as the one he himself had pulled out of the sorting hat in his second year. The sword had once belonged to Godric Gryffindor, founder of Harry's house. He was gazing at it, remembering how it had come to his aid when he had thought all hope was lost, when he noticed a patch of silvery light dancing and shimmering on the glass case. He looked around for the source of the light and saw a silver white, shining brightly from within a black cabinet behind him, whose door had not been closed properly. Harry hesitated, glanced at Fawkes, then got up, walked across the office, and pulled open the cabinet door. A shallow stone basin lay there with odd carvings around the edges, runes and symbols that Harry did not recognize. The silvery light was coming from the basin's contents, which were like nothing Harry had ever seen before. He could not tell whether the substance was liquid or gas. It was a bright whitish silver, and it was moving ceaselessly. The surface of it became ruffled like water beneath wind, and then, like clouds, separated and swirled smoothly. It looked like light made liquid, or like wind made solid. Harry couldn't make up his mind. He wanted to touch it to find out what it felt like, but nearly 4 years' experience of the magical world told him that sticking his hand into a bowl full of some unknown substance was a very stupid thing to do. He therefore pulled his wand out of the inside of his robes, cast a nervous look around the office, looked back at the contents of the basin, and prodded them. The surface of the silvery stuff inside the basin began to swirl very fast. Harry bent closely, his head right inside the cabinet. The silvery substance had become transparent. It looked like glass. He looked down into it, expecting to see the stone bottom of the basin, and saw instead an enormous room below the surface of the mysterious substance, a room into which he seemed to be looking through a circular window in the ceiling. The room was dimly lit. He thought it might even be underground, for there were no windows, merely torches and brackets such as the ones that illuminated the walls of Hogwarts. Lowering his face so that his nose was a mere inch away from the glassy substance, Harry saw that rows and rows of witches and wizards were seated around every wall on what seemed to be benches rising in levels. An empty chair stood in the very center of the room. There was something about the chair that gave Harry an ominous feeling. Chains encircled the arms of it, as though its occupants were usually tied to it. Where was this place? It surely wasn't Hogwarts. He had never seen a room like that there in the castle. Moreover, the crowd in the mysterious room at the bottom of the basin was comprised of adults, and Harry knew there were not nearly that many teachers at Hogwarts. They seemed, he thought, to be waiting for something, even though he could only see the tops of their hats. All of their faces seemed to be pointing in one direction, and none of them were talking to one another. The basin being circular and the room he was observing square, Harry could not make out what was going on in the corners of it. He looked even closer, tilting his head, trying to see. The tip of his nose touched the strange substance into which he was staring. Dumbledore's office gave an almighty lurch. Harry was thrown forward and pitched headfirst into the substance inside the basin. But his head did not hit the stone bottom. He was falling through something icy cold and black. It was like being sucked into a dark whirlpool. And suddenly, Harry found himself sitting on a bench at the end of the room, inside the basin, a bench raised high above the others. He looked up at the high stone ceiling, expecting to see the circular window through which he had just been staring, but there was nothing there but dark, solid stone. Breathing hard and fast, Harry looked around him. Not one of the witches and wizards in the room, and there were at least 200 of them, was looking at him. Not one of them seemed to have noticed that a 14-year-old boy had just dropped from the ceiling into their midst. Harry turned to the wizard next to him on the bench and uttered a loud cry of surprise that reverberated around the silent room. He was sitting right next to Albus Dumbledore. "Professor," Harry said in a kind of strangled whisper, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I was just looking at that basin in your cabinet. Where are we?" But Dumbledore didn't move or speak. He ignored Harry completely, like every other wizard on the benches. He was staring into the far corner of the room where there was a door. Harry gazed, nonplussed, at Dumbledore, then around at the silently watchful crowd, then back at Dumbledore, and then it dawned on him. Once before, Harry had found himself somewhere that nobody could see or hear him. That time he had fallen through a page in an enchanted diary, right into somebody else's memory, and unless he was very much mistaken, something of the sort had happened again. Harry raised his wand hand, hesitated, and then waved it energetically in front of Dumbledore's face. Dumbledore did not blink, look around at Harry, or indeed move at all. And that, in Harry's opinion, settled the matter. Dumbledore wouldn't ignore him like that. He was inside a memory, and this was not the present-day Dumbledore. Yet it couldn't be that long ago. The Dumbledore sitting next to him now was silver-haired, just like the present-day Dumbledore. But what was this place? What were all these wizards waiting for? Harry looked around more carefully. The room, as he had suspected when observing it from above, was almost certainly underground. More of a dungeon than a room, he thought. There was a bleak and forbidding air about the place, and there were no pictures on the walls, no decorations at all, just these serried rows of benches, rising in levels all around the room, all positioned so that they had a clear view of that chair with the chains on its arms. Before Harry could reach any conclusions about the place in which they were, he heard footsteps. The door in the corner of the dungeon opened, and 3 people entered, or at least 1 man, flanked by 2 Dementors. Harry's insides went cold. The Dementors, tall, hooded creatures whose faces were concealed, were gliding slowly toward the chair in the center of the room, each grasping one of the man's arms with their dead and rotten-looking hands. The man between them looked as though he was about to faint, and Harry couldn't blame him. He knew the Dementors could not touch him inside a memory, but he remembered their power only too well. The watching crowd recoiled slightly as the Dementors placed the man in the chained chair and glided back out of the room. The door swung shut behind them. Harry looked down at the man now sitting in the chair and saw that it was Karkaroff. Oh shit, Karkaroff? I wonder what he did. Unlike Dumbledore, Karkaroff looked much younger. His hair and goatee were black. He was not dressed in sleek furs, but in thin and ragged robes. He was shaking. Even as Harry watched, the chains on the arms of the chair glowed suddenly gold and snaked their way up Karkaroff's arms, binding him there. Igor Karkaroff, said a curt voice to Harry's left. Harry looked around and saw Mr. Crouch standing up in the middle of the bench beside him. Crouch's hair was dark. His face was much less lined. He looked fit and alert. You have been brought from Azkaban to present evidence to the Ministry of Magic. You have given us to understand that you have important information for us. Karkaroff straightened himself as best he could, tightly bound to the chair. I have, sir, he said, and although his voice was very scared, Harry could still hear the familiar, unctuous note in it. I wish to be of use to the Ministry. I wish to help. I know that the Ministry is trying to round up the last of the Dark Lord's supporters. I am eager to assist in any way I can. There was a murmur around the benches. Some of the wizards and witches were surveying Karkaroff with interest, others with pronounced mistrust. Then Harry heard, quite distinctively, from Dumbledore's other side, a familiar, growling voice saying, "Filth." Harry leaned forward so that he could see past Dumbledore. Mad-Eye Moody was sitting there, except that there was a very noticeable difference in his appearance. He did not have his magical eye, but 2 normal eyes. Both were looking down upon Karkaroff, and both were narrowed in intense dislike. Crouch is going to let him out, Moody breathed quietly to Dumbledore. He's done a deal with him. It took me 6 months to track him down, and Crouch is going to let him go if he's got enough new names. Let's hear his information, I say, and throw him straight back to the Dementors. Dumbledore made a small noise of dissent through his long crooked nose. I was forgetting. You don't like the Dementors, do you, Albus? Said Moody with a sardonic smile. No, said Dumbledore calmly. I'm afraid I don't. I have long felt that the Ministry is wrong to ally itself with such creatures. But for filth like this, Moody said softly. You say you have names for us, Karkaroff, said Mr. Crouch. Let us hear them, please. You must understand, said Karkaroff hurriedly, that he who must not be named operated always in the greatest secrecy. He preferred that we, I mean to say his supporters, and I regret now very deeply that I ever counted myself among them. Get on with it, sneered Moody. We never knew the names of every one of our fellows. He alone knew exactly who we all were. Which was a wise move, wasn't it, as it prevented someone like you, Karkaroff, from turning all of them in, muttered Moody. Yet you say you have some names for us, said Mr. Crouch. I do, said Karkaroff breathlessly, and these were important supporters, mark you, people I saw with my own eyes doing his bidding. I give this information as a sign that I fully and totally renounce him, and am filled with remorse so deep I can barely— These names are, said Mr. Crouch sharply. Karkaroff drew a deep breath. There was Antonian Dolohov, he said. I saw him torture countless muggles and non-supporters of the Dark Lord, and helped him do it, murmured Moody. We have already apprehended Dolohov, said Crouch. He was caught shortly after yourself. Indeed, said Karkaroff, his eyes widening. I am delighted to hear that. But he didn't look it. Harry could tell that this news had come as a real blow to him. One of his names was worthless. Any others? Said Crouch coldly. Why, yes, there was Rosier, said Karkaroff hurriedly. Evan Rosier. Rosier is dead, said Crouch. He was caught shortly after you were too. He preferred to fight rather than come quietly and was killed in the struggle. Took a bit of me with him, though, whispered Moody to Harry's right. Harry looked at him once more and saw him indicating the large chunk out of his nose to Dumbledore. No, no more than Rosier deserved, said Karkaroff, a real note of panic in his voice now. Harry could see that he was starting to worry that none of his information would be of any use to the Ministry. Karkaroff's eyes darted toward the door in the corner, behind which the Dementors undoubtedly still stood waiting. Any more? Said Crouch. Yes, said Karkaroff. There was Travers. He helped murder the McKinnons. Mulciber. He specialized in the Imperious Curse, forced countless people to do horrific things. Rookwood, who is a spy, and past you must not be named useful information from inside the Ministry itself. Harry could tell that, this time, Karkaroff had struck gold. The watching crowd was all murmuring together. Rookwood, said Mr. Crouch, nodding to a witch sitting in front of him, who began scribbling upon a piece of parchment. Augustus Rookwood, of the Department of Mysteries. I'm going to pause there for a minute. For those of you that have played the Harry Potter, or I should say Hogwarts Legacy game, Rookwood is actually one of the guys that's in there that you have to fight. And they took Rookwood from this book and used him basically as like an evil god that you had to go after, which is pretty cool that we're reading about his name in here when we had to fight him in Hogwarts Legacy as well. Spoiler alert for those that haven't played the game yet. But I just find it fascinating that Rookwood is actually a part of the Hogwarts game too. The very same, said Karkaroff eagerly. I believe he used a network of well-placed wizards both inside the Ministry and out to collect information. But Travers and Mulciber we have, said Mr. Crouch. Very well, Karkaroff. If that is all, you will be returned to Azkaban while we decide. Not yet, cried Karkaroff, looking quite desperate. Wait, I have more. Harry could see him sweating in the torchlight, his white skin contrasting strongly with the black of his hair and beard. Snape, he shouted. Severus Snape. Snape has been cleared by this council, said Crouch disdainfully. He has been vouched for by Albus Dumbledore. No, shouted Karkaroff, straining at the chains that bound him to the chair. I assure you, Severus Snape is a Death Eater. Dumbledore had gotten to his feet. I have given evidence already on this matter, he said calmly. Severus Snape was indeed a Death Eater. However, he rejoined our side before Lord Voldemort's downfall and turned spy for us, at great personal risk. He is now no more a Death Eater than I am. Harry turned to look at Mad-Eye Moody. He was wearing a look of deep skepticism behind Dumbledore's back. Very well, Karkaroff, Crouch said coldly. You have been of assistance. I shall review your case. You will return to Azkaban in the meantime. Mr. Crouch's voice faded. Harry looked around. The dungeon was dissolving as though it were made of smoke. Everything was fading. He could see only his own body. All else was swirling darkness. And then the dungeon returned. Harry was sitting in a different seat, still on the highest bench, but now to the left side of Mr. Crouch. The atmosphere seemed quite different, relaxed, even cheerful. The witches and wizards all around the walls were talking to one another, almost as though they were at some sort of sporting event. Harry noticed a witch halfway up the rows of benches opposite. She had short blonde hair and was wearing magenta robes and was sucking at the end of an acid green quill. It was unmistakably a younger Rita Skeeter. Harry looked around. Dumbledore was sitting beside him again, wearing different robes. Mr. Crouch looked more tired and somehow fiercer, gaunter. Harry understood. It was a different memory, a different day, a different trial. The door in the corner opened, and Leto Bagman walked into the room. This was not, however, a Leto Bagman gone to seed, but a Leto Bagman who was clearly at the height of his Quidditch-playing fitness. His nose wasn't broken now. He was tall and lean and muscular. Bagman looked nervous and sat down in the chained chair. But it did not bind him there as it had bound Karkaroff, and Bagman, perhaps taking heart from this, glanced around at the watching crowd, waved at a couple of them, and managed a small smile. That's kind of weird that one would be chained and the other wouldn't. Little Bagman, you have been brought here in front of the Council of Magical Law to answer charges related to the activities of the Death Eaters, said Mr. Crouch. We have heard the evidence against you and are about to reach our verdict. Do you have anything to add to your testimony before we pronounce judgment? Harry couldn't believe his ears. Leto Bagman, a Death Eater? Only, said Bagman, smiling awkwardly. Well, I know I've been a bit of an idiot. One or two wizards and witches in the surrounding seats smiled indulgently. Mr. Crouch did not appear to share their feelings. He was staring down at Leto Bagman with an expression of the utmost severity and dislike. You never spoke a truer word, boy, someone muttered dryly to Dumbledore behind Harry. He looked around and saw Moody sitting there again. If I didn't know he'd always been dim, I'd have said some of those bludgers had permanently affected his brain. Ludovic Bagman, you were caught passing information to Lord Voldemort's supporters, said Mr. Crouch. For this, I suggest a term of imprisonment in Azkaban lasting no less than. But there was an angry outcry from the surrounding benches. Several of the witches and wizards around the walls stood up, shaking their heads and even their fists at Mr. Crouch. But I've told you, I had no idea. Bagman called earnestly over the crowd's babbling, his round blue eyes widening. None at all. Old Rookwood was a friend of my dad's. Never crossed my mind he was in with you-know-who. I thought I was collecting information for our side, and Rookwood kept talking about getting me a job in the ministry later on, once my Quidditch days are over. I can't keep getting hit by bludgers for the rest of my life, can I? There were titters from the crowd. It will be put to the vote, said Mr. Crouch coldly. He turned to the right-hand side of the dungeon. The jury will please raise their hands, those in favor of imprisonment. Harry looked toward the right-hand side of the dungeon. Not one person raised their hand. Many of the witches and wizards around the walls began to clap. One of the witches on the jury stood up. Yes, barked Crouch. We just like to congratulate Mr. Bagman on his splendid performance for England in the Quidditch match against Turkey last Saturday, the witch said breathlessly. Mr. Crouch looked furious. The dungeon was ringing with applause now. Bagman got to his feet and bowed, beaming. Despicable! Mr. Crouch spat at Dumbledore, sitting down as Bagman walked out of the dungeon. Rookwood get him a job indeed. The day Leto Bagman joins us will be a sad day indeed for the ministry. And the dungeon dissolved again. When it had returned, Harry looked around. He and Dumbledore were still sitting beside Mr. Crouch, but the atmosphere could not have been more different. There was total silence, broken only by the dry sobs of a frail, wispy-looking witch in the seat next to Mr. Crouch. She was clutching a handkerchief to her mouth with trembling hands. Harry looked up at Crouch and saw that he looked gaunter and grayer than ever before. A nerve was twitching in his temple. Bring them in, he said, and his voice echoed through the silent dungeon. The door in the corner opened yet again. 6 Dementors entered this time, flanking a group of 4 people. Harry saw the people in the crowd turn to look up at Mr. Crouch. A few of them whispered to one another. The Dementors placed each of the 4 people in front of four people in the 4 chairs with chained arms that now stood on the dungeon floor. There was a thick-set man who stared blankly up at Crouch, a thinner and more nervous-looking man whose eyes were darting around the crowd, a woman with thick, shiny dark hair and heavily hooded eyes, who was sitting in the chained chair as though it were a throne, and a boy in his late teens who looked nothing short of petrified. He was shivering, his straw-colored hair all over his face, his freckled skin milk-white. The wispy little witch beside Crouch began to rock backward and forward in her seat, whimpering into her handkerchief. Crouch stood up. He looked down upon the 4 in front of him, and there was pure hatred in his face. You have been brought here before the Council of Magical Law, he said clearly, so that we may pass judgment on you for a crime so heinous. Father, said the boy with the straw-colored hair, Father, please, that we have rarely heard the like of it within this court, said Crouch, speaking more loudly, drowning out his son's voice. We have heard the evidence against you. The 4 of you stand accused of capturing an Auror, Frank Longbottom, and subjecting him to the Cruciatus Curse, believing him to have knowledge of the present whereabouts of your exiled master, he who must not be named. Father, I didn't, shrieked the boy in chains below. I didn't. I swear it, Father. Don't send me back to the Dementors. You are further accused, bellowed Mr. Crouch, of using the Cruciatus Curse on Frank Longbottom's wife when he would not give you information. You plan to restore he who must not be named to power, and to resume the lives of violence you presumably led while he was strong. I now ask the jury. Mother, screamed the boy below, and the wispy little witch beside Crouch began to sob, rocking backward and forward. Mother, stop him. Mother, I didn't do it. It wasn't me. I now ask the jury, shouted Mr. Crouch, to raise their hands if they believe, as I do, that these crimes deserve a life sentence in Azkaban. In unison, the witches and wizards along the right-hand side of the dungeon raised their hands. The crowd around the walls began to clap, as it had for Bagman, their faces full of savage triumph. The boy began to scream. No, Mother, no, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. I didn't know. Don't send me there. Don't let him. The Dementors were gliding back into the room. The boy's 3 companions rose quietly from their seats. The woman with the heavy Lidded eyes looked up at Crouch and called, "The Dark Lord will rise again, Crouch. Throw us into Azkaban. We will wait. He will rise again and we will come and he will rise again and will come for us. He will reward us beyond any of his other supporters. We alone were faithful. We alone tried to find him." But the boy was trying to fight off the Dementors, even though Harry could see their cold, draining power starting to affect him. The crowd was jeering, some of them on their feet, as the woman swept out of the dungeon and the boy continued to struggle. "I'm your son," he screamed up at Crouch. "I'm your son. You are no son of mine," bellowed Mr. Crouch, his eyes bulging suddenly. "I have no son." The wispy witch beside him gave a great gasp and slumped in her seat. She had fainted. Crouch appeared not to have noticed. "Take them away," Crouch roared at the Dementor, spit flying from his mouth. "Take them away, and may they rot there." "Father, Father, I wasn't involved." "No, no, Father, please." "I think, Harry, it is time to return to my office," said a quiet voice in Harry's ear. Harry started. He looked around. Then he looked on his other side. There was an Albus Dumbledore sitting on his right, watching Crouch's son being dragged away by the Dementors, and there was an Albus Dumbledore on his left, looking right at him. "Come," said Dumbledore on his left, and he put his hand under Harry's elbow. Harry felt himself rising into the air. The dungeon dissolved around him for a moment. All was blackness, and then he felt, though he had done a slow-motion somersault, suddenly landing flat on his feet in what seemed like the dazzling light of Dumbledore's sunlit office. The stone basin was shimmering in the cabinet in front of him, and Albus Dumbledore was standing beside him. "Professor," Harry gasped, "I know I shouldn't have. I didn't mean—" The cabinet door was sort of open, and— "I quite understand," said Dumbledore. He lifted the basin, carried it over to his desk, placed it upon the polished top, and sat down in the chair behind him. He motioned for Harry to sit down opposite him. He did so, staring at the stone basin. The contents had returned to their original silvery white state, swirling and rippling beneath his gaze. "What is it?" Harry asked shakily. "This. It is called a Pensieve," said Dumbledore. "I sometimes find, and I am sure you know the feeling, that I simply have too many thoughts and memories crammed into my head." Said Harry, who couldn't truthfully say that he had ever felt anything of the sort. "At these times," said Dumbledore, indicating the stone basin, "I use the Pensieve. One simply siphons the excess thoughts from one's mind, pours them into the basin, and examines them at one's leisure. It becomes easier to spot patterns and links, you understand, when they are in this form." "You mean that stuffs your thoughts?" said Harry, staring at the swirling white substance in the basin. "Certainly," said Dumbledore. "Let me show you." Dumbledore drew his wand out of the inside of his robes and placed the tip into his own silvery hair near his temple. When he took the wand away, hair seemed to be clinging to it, but then Harry saw that it was in fact a glistening strand of the same strange silvery white substance that filled the Pensieve. Dumbledore added his fresh thought to the basin, and Harry, astonished, saw his own face swimming around the surface of the bowl. Dumbledore placed his long hands on either side of the Pensieve and swirled it, rather as a gold prospector would pan for fragments of gold. And Harry saw his own face change smoothly into Snape's, who opened his mouth and spoke to the ceiling, his voice echoing slightly. "It's coming back. Karkaroff's too, stronger and clearer than ever. A connection I could have made without assistance." Dumbledore sighed, "but never mind." He peered over the top of his half-moon spectacles at Harry, who was gaping at Snape's face, which was continuing to swirl around the bowl. "I was using the Pensieve when Mr. Fudge arrived for our meeting and put it away rather hastily. Undoubtedly, I did not fasten the cabinet door properly. Naturally, it would have attracted your attention." "I'm sorry," Harry mumbled. Dumbledore shook his head. "Curiosity is not a sin," he said, "but we should exercise caution with our curiosity. Yes, indeed." Frowning slightly, he prodded the thoughts within the basin with the tip of his wand. Instantly, a figure rose out of it, a plump, scowling girl of about 16, who began to revolve slowly, with her feet still in the basin. She took no notice whatsoever of Harry or Professor Dumbledore. When she spoke, her voice echoed as Snape's had done, as though it were coming from the depths of the stone basin. "He put a hex on me, Professor Dumbledore, and I was only teasing him, sir. I only said I had seen him kissing Florence behind the greenhouses last Thursday." "But why, Bertha?" said Dumbledore sadly, looking up at the now silently revolving girl. "Why did you have to follow him in the first place?" "Bertha," Harry whispered, looking up at her. Was that Bertha Jorkins?" "Yes," said Dumbledore, prodding the thoughts in the basin again. Bertha sank back into them, and then became silvery and opaque once more. "That was Bertha as I remember her at school." The silvery light from the Pensieve illuminated Dumbledore's face, and it struck Harry suddenly how very old he was looking. He knew, of course, that Dumbledore was getting on in years, but somehow he never really thought of Dumbledore as an old man. "So, Harry," said Dumbledore quietly, "before you got lost in my thoughts, you wanted to tell me something." "Yes," said Harry. "Professor, I was in divination just now, and I fell asleep. He hesitated here, wondering if a reprimand was coming, but Dumbledore merely said, "Quite understandable. Continue." "Well, I had a dream," said Harry. "A dream about Lord Voldemort. He was torturing Wormtail." "You know who Wormtail—" "I do know," said Dumbledore promptly. "Please continue." "Voldemort got a letter from an owl. He said something like Wormtail's blender had been repaired. He said someone was dead. Then he said Wormtail wouldn't be fed to the snake. There was a snake beside his chair. He said he'd been feeding me to it instead. Then he did the Cruciatus curse on Wormtail, and my scar hurt," Harry said. "It woke me up. It hurt so badly." Dumbledore merely looked at him. "That's all," said Harry. "I see," said Dumbledore quietly. "I see. Now, has your scar hurt at any other time this year except the time it woke you up over the summer?" "No, How did you know it woke me up over the summer?" said Harry, astonished. "You are not Sirius's only correspondent," said Dumbledore. "I have also been in contact with him ever since he left Hogwarts last year. It was I who suggested the mountainside cave as the safest place for him to stay." Dumbledore got up and began walking up and down behind his desk. Every now and then he placed his wand tip to his temple, removed another shining silver thought, and added it to the Pensieve. The thoughts inside began to swirl so fast that Harry couldn't make out anything clearly. It was merely a blur of color. "Professor," he said quietly, after a couple of minutes. Dumbledore stopped pacing and looked at Harry. "My apologies," he said quietly. He sat back down at his desk. Do you know why my scar's hurting me?" Dumbledore looked very intently at Harry for a moment, and then said, "I have a theory, no more than that. It is my belief that your scar hurts both when Lord Voldemort is near you and when he is feeling a particularly strong surge of hatred." "But why?" "Because you and he are connected by the curse that failed," said Dumbledore. "That is no ordinary scar." "So you think that dream, did it really happen?" "It is possible," said Dumbledore. "I would say probable." "Harry, did you see Voldemort?" "No," said Harry, "just the back of his chair. But there wouldn't have been anything to see, would there? I mean, he hasn't got a body, has he?" But then how could he have held the wand?" Harry said slowly. "How indeed," muttered Dumbledore. "How indeed." Neither Dumbledore nor Harry spoke for a while. Dumbledore was gazing across the room, and every now and then placing his wand tip to his temple and adding another shining silver thought to the seething mass within the Pensieve. "Professor," Harry said at last, "do you think he's getting stronger?" "Voldemort?" said Dumbledore, looking at Harry over the Pensieve. It was the characteristic, piercing look Dumbledore had given him on other occasions, and always made Harry feel as though Dumbledore was seeing right through him in a way that even Moody's magical eye could not. "Once again, Harry, I can only give you my suspicions." Dumbledore sighed again, and he looked older and wearier than ever. "The years of Voldemort's ascent to power," he said, "were marked with disappearances. Bertha Jorkins has vanished without a trace in the place where Voldemort was certainly known to be last. Mr. Crouch, too, has disappeared within these very grounds, and there was a third disappearance, one which the Ministry, I regret to say, do not consider of any importance, for it concerns a Muggle. His name was Frank Bryce. He lived in the village where Voldemort's father grew up, and he has not been seen since last August. You see, I read the Muggle newspapers, unlike most of my Ministry friends." Dumbledore looked very seriously at Harry. These disappearances seem to have been linked. The Ministry disagrees, as you may have heard while waiting outside my office." Harry nodded. Silence fell between them again, Dumbledore extracting thoughts every now and then. Harry felt as though he ought to go, but his curiosity held him in his chair. "Professor," he said again. "Yes, Harry," said Dumbledore. Could I ask you about that court thing I was in the Pensieve?" "You could," said Dumbledore heavily. "I attended it many times, but some trials come back to me more clearly than others, particularly now. You know the trial you found me in, the one with Crouch's son? Well, were they talking about Neville's parents?" Dumbledore gave Harry a very sharp look. "Has Neville never told you why he has been brought up by his grandmother?" he said. Harry shook his head, wondering, as he did so, how he could have failed to ask Neville this, in almost 4 years of knowing him. "Yes, they were talking about Neville's parents," said Dumbledore. "His father, Frank, was an Auror, just like Professor Moody. He and his wife were tortured for information about Voldemort's whereabouts after he lost his powers, as you heard." "So they're dead?" said Harry quietly. "No," said Dumbledore, his voice full of a bitterness Harry had never heard there before. "They are insane. They are both in St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries. I believe Neville visits them with his grandmother during the holidays. They do not recognize him." Harry sat there, horror-struck. He had never in 4 years bothered to find out. "The Longbottoms were very popular," said Dumbledore. "The attacks on them came after Voldemort's fall from power, just when everyone thought they were safe. Those attacks caused a wave of fury such as I have never known. The Ministry was under great pressure to catch those who had done it. Unfortunately, the Longbottoms' evidence was, given their condition, none too reliable. Then Mr. Crouch's son might not have been involved, said Harry slowly. Dumbledore shook his head. As to that, I have no idea. Harry sat in silence once more, watching the contents of the Pensieve swirl. There were 2 more questions he was burning to ask, but they concerned the guilt of living people. He said Mr. Bagman has never been accused of any dark activity since, said Dumbledore calmly. Right, said Harry hastily, staring at the contents of the Pensieve again, which were swirling more slowly now that Dumbledore had stopped adding thoughts. But the Pensieve seemed to be asking his question for him. Snape's face was swimming on the surface again. Dumbledore glanced down into it and then up at Snape. No more, has Professor Snape, he said. Harry looked into Dumbledore's light blue eyes, and the thing he really wanted to know spilled out of his mouth before he could stop it. What made you think he'd really stop supporting Voldemort, Professor? Dumbledore held Harry's gaze for a few seconds, and then said, That, Harry, is a matter between Professor Snape and myself. Harry knew that the interview was over. Dumbledore did not look angry, yet there was a finality in his tone that told Harry it was time to go. He stood up, and so did Dumbledore. Harry, he said as Harry reached the door, please do not speak about Neville's parents to anybody else. He has the right to let people know when he is ready. Yes, Professor, said Harry, turning to go. And, Harry looked back. Dumbledore was standing over the Pensieve, his face lit from beneath by its silvery spots of light, looking older than ever. He stared at Harry for a moment and then said, Good luck with the 3rd task. So we're going to stop there. We read quite a few chapters. Harry just found himself in a whole nother cup of worms. But I think there's, other than like what they say in the book, you can also take like a life lesson out of that, is if people tell you something, it's their story to tell. Don't tell somebody else's story that you have no say in. Like it's not your place to say something. That's basically what he's telling Harry, is that Neville's story is Neville's to tell. It's not Harry's to tell. So Harry has no right that if people say anything or ask, he has no right to just spew it out, whether he's angry at somebody or upset about something or somebody asks him something. He has no right to say anything like that. Not even to Ron, not even to Hermione. I'm sure he probably will tell Ron and Hermione because he seems to tell them everything. But I mean, don't we all tell our best friends everything? But at the same time, he's technically not supposed to say anything. So hopefully he doesn't. But I guess we'll find out when we read the next chapter. But it's also very interesting to know that Snape was a Death Eater. That he followed in the footsteps of Voldemort, which means that he could potentially still hate Harry Potter because of the fact that Harry took out Lord Voldemort and put a stop to the Death Eaters, and he had to turn to Dumbledore for help and support and stop doing what he did, which he's heavily into Defense Against the Dark Arts, right? Which means he knows some pretty heavy dark arts materials. He has to. Why else would he be so heavily invested in it? And then knowing that that he was a Death Eater or a Death Dealer or whatever they like to call them, it just goes to show that is where all of the hate is coming from when it comes to Harry, is that Harry's put a stop to Lord Voldemort, and then Snape doesn't seem to like it. But, I mean, Professor Dumbledore seems to be like heavily invested in the fact that Snape is now on the good side. I mean, obviously he lets him work in the school and teach potions class and stuff like that, but also, like, finding that information out, I mean, he's going to tell Ron and Hermione, obviously, but finding that information out would be something I would be leery about, knowing the fact of who Harry is and who Ron is and who Hermione is. I mean, more so Harry than anything else, but Ron, Harry, and Hermione kind of like a clique. They all stick together. They have their own thing. And knowing that Snape is a Death Eater, or was a Death Eater, would give more information as to why they would suspect Snape for everything that they do. I mean, even going back to the first book, they suspected him of wanting to hurt Harry since the beginning. And that just gives more insight as to why they would feel that way and why it would seem that way. And even if it didn't seem that way, it still leads this. It still gives him the suspicion of why he is the way he is because he was a death dealer or a Death Eater, and worked with Voldemort. But I mean, that's kind of heavy material, especially for, I mean, granted, it is a magical world, it is like the book is fiction, but given that kind of stuff, it is pretty heavy for a 14-year-old to sit there and have to deal with knowing all of that information, because technically he shouldn't have to be dealing with that. He shouldn't need to know any of that information, let alone finding out that information. It's not his business. It's not for him to know. But given the fact that he does know that, that's got to impact him a little bit and his thoughts and his mind into a lot more stuff. And I'm sure he'll be talking to Sirius about it as well, considering that he just found out all of this information. So he's going to be wanting to get, he's going to be wanting to understand it from Sirius's point of view as well, or message Sirius about it, I would think. I mean, that's my assumption, is that he's going to want to get Ron and Hermione's point of view. He's going to want to get Sirius's point of view and advice and everything else. But I guess we'll find out the next time. But it is very interesting that we are finding out that Severus Snape's name came up as a Death Eater, and he was supposed to be put, like, they called his name out in the trial and everything, that he was part of the problem instead of part of the solution. So I mean, for Dumbledore to turn him, good, or for Snape to be good. I mean, I think there's more to it at the end. I really do, because there's no way that you're going to be a Death Eater and then all of a sudden just be good and be with Dumbledore and all of this and that, because they say that the only powerful wizard strong enough to defeat the Dark Lord is Dumbledore, right? But Harry Potter seemed to do it as well. And the thing too is, everybody was following Voldemort because he was so powerful. But why would you change sides knowing that, like, I would think that Severus Snape honestly would be working both angles of it. Like, that's how it feels, because he's always taking points from Gryffindor, especially Harry, Ron, and Hermione. He can't stand them. He likes Slytherins. Slytherins are known for going into the dark side of things all the time, and honestly, I don't think I would want to be a part of something like that, or even associate with a school that has that in there. Like, turns out more dark wizards than good. Like, that doesn't seem very comforting to know that my school is dropping off dark wizards. But that's just me. But yeah, I mean, it just leads more into it. Like, what is, because Snape is head of Slytherin House, so what is he teaching them? What is he teaching Malfoy and Crabbe and Goyle and all of the other Slytherins? Because of the fact that he was a Death Dealer. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting to see and understand that part, but I guess we'll have to find out. But thank you guys for listening. I want to make sure to comment what your guys' thoughts are. Let me know what you guys think about it and how you feel about it. And I will catch everybody in the next one. So thank you for listening. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, guys. This is Baby Hulk Rage signing off. Thanks for being a part of the read along with me, and I will catch you in the next one. Much love, guys. Bye.